The Crazy Horse and Crook Fight of 1876, New Discoveries at the Battle of the Rosebud by Keith T. Werts and Stevan C. Booras. Dedication to Robert, Michael, Douglas, and Aaron Werts, and Beverly J. Booras, in memory of Douglas Allen Werts, 1972 to 2010. His laughter and humor are greatly missed. Introduction. This book is about the Battle of the Rosebud, one of the 7 major battles of the 1876-1877 Sioux Indian War. The Rosebud Battle occurred on June 17, 1876, in southeast Montana, near a small and meandering stream called Rosebud Creek. We became interested in researching the Sioux Indian War after reading numerous participant and contemporary accounts of the various battles. The Battle of the Rosebud was one of the more colorful and eventful battles of the war, and was a prelude to General Custer's defeat along the Little Bighorn River only 8 days later. After their victory at the Little Bighorn, the Sioux and Northern Cheyenne were continuously pursued and attacked, especially during General Miles's winter campaign. As the war progressed, the ability of the Sioux and Cheyenne to wage war became increasingly diminished, except for Sitting Bull's Hunkpapa, whom escaped to Canada, and a small band of Sioux under Chief Lame Deer. Most Sioux and Cheyenne leaders decided by early 1877 that they had no choice but to surrender to life on the reservation. They surrendered not for the fact that they had been defeated on the battlefield. Rather, they gave up because they were starving and no longer had the will nor the means to carry on the struggle. With little choice, they surrendered to the powerful and overwhelming force of the United States government. When we began our research, many source books and written accounts about some of the various battles seemed to be contradictory at times in regards to certain events. We decided to conduct our own investigation regarding some of these details. We delved even further into first-hand stories and reports, and visited many of the battlefields to learn the topography. We came to better understand how the battles were executed by matching events with the physical layout of the sites. However, certain events still seemed confusing. We decided to investigate even further, and to do our own research using metal detectors. We believed that physical evidence would probably clear up some of the contradictory historical accounts, not just for ourselves, but for other interested historians as well. For a 20-year period beginning in 1987, the authors made dozens of trips to the Rosebud and other battlefield sites. We recovered battle artifacts at previously undiscovered locations. Many of these discoveries were very significant since they shed new light concerning particular events of each battle. This book provides a general history leading up to the 1876-1877 Sioux Indian War. And, as stated before, the book contains a detailed account of the Rosebud battle, descriptions of recovered battle-related artifacts, and new interpretations and clarifications regarding certain events. The primary reason for writing this book is to provide a record of discoveries, so others may utilize the information in the future. The authors do not claim to be the final authorities regarding the Rosebud battle. That honor should go to some very able contemporary scholars and historians. After reading the book, we invite others to make their own conclusions in regards to the discoveries. At the very least, we hope readers enjoy the book and that we have provided a little more insight into events that occurred so long ago along Rosebud Creek. We wish to thank the staff of the following organizations for their generous assistance in providing suggestions, material, and resources: Billings Parmley Library, Billings, Montana, Spokane Public Library, Spokane, Washington, Spokane Valley Library, Spokane Valley, Washington, Gonzaga University Library, Spokane, Washington, Eastern Washington University Library, Cheney, Washington, Multnomah Public Library, Portland, Oregon, St. Edward Public Library, St. Edward, Nebraska, Montana Historical Society Research Center, Helena, Montana, Kansas State Historical Society Library Archives, especially Teresa Coble, Topeka, Kansas, Nebraska Historical Society Library Archives, especially Linda Hine, Lincoln, Nebraska, and the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, Crow Agency, Montana. The following individuals provided valuable information and suggestions: Sharon Baker, St. Edward, Nebraska; Ralph Hines, Newport, Washington; Put Thompson, Crow Agency, Montana; John Dorner, Chief Historian, Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument; Bill and Keith Bean, Arms Collectors, Spokane, Washington; Dr. James Brust, San Pedro, California; Jerry Keenan, Longmont, Colorado; Sandy Barnard, Wake Forest, North Carolina; and Douglas Scott, Lincoln, Nebraska. Ralph Hines provided the authors with valuable photographs from his individual collection, some of which are included in this book. Charles D. Collins. Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, generously gave his time to create new digital maps of the Rosebud battlefield. We thank them for their kindness and generosity. The following friends and relatives allowed us to drag them out to the battlefields to help in the search for physical evidence: Alan Werts, Portland, Oregon; Mike Werts, Homer, Alaska; Doug Werts, my beloved son, now deceased; Brian Compton, Weiser, Idaho; and Dick Rohn, St. Edward, Nebraska. We hope they had fun exploring Western history. We enjoyed their company. At the Rosebud battlefield, Jessie Huffman not only allowed us access to her ranch to conduct research, she also went out with the authors on many occasions to help. Jessie also shared her knowledge of the battle, her theories and topographical information that were very beneficial. Jessie became a close friend, and we thoroughly enjoyed her company on many occasions over the years. Jerry Eakel and Penny Penson Eakel of Sheridan, Wyoming, and owners of the Big Bend Ranch, were also very generous with their help and friendship, and provided the authors with their knowledge of the history of the Rosebud battle and of the early settlement in the area. Penny is the granddaughter of Tom Penson. In 1898, he was one of the first to establish a ranch in the immediate area. Jerry and Penny graciously gave the authors a horseback tour of the battlefield in the early 1990s and pointed out important sites. We also wish to thank Mary Young, now deceased, for allowing us to walk across her land and to take photographs. Tim and Linda Smith allowed us to search for artifacts on their land, and Tim went out with the authors on 2 occasions to help. David and Kathy Helvey were also very helpful and allowed us access to portions of their land. Jason Pitch, Gary, Owen, Montana, provided a tremendous amount of help with the search of artifacts. He shared his own discoveries and allowed us to publish much of what he found at the Rosebud site. Additionally, Jason shared his vast knowledge regarding weapons and ammunition of the period and his in-depth knowledge of the history of the entire Indian Wars period. Paul Godfrey, Spokane, Washington, provided technical assistance regarding computer programs and troubleshooting. His assistance was invaluable. Alan Casamodal, Billings, Montana, spent an entire day piloting his Piper J3 over the various battlefields. His flying skills allowed us to take many aerial photographs of the Rosebud battlefield and other important battle sites. Linda Jenkins, Werts, Portland, Oregon, was enormously helpful. Not only did she spend countless hours researching the 1876 Sioux Indian War, she also found many rare documents and texts, and then shared them with the authors. Ms. Werts also generously edited much of this book, a chore that was no doubt challenging at times. Her work was especially valuable and greatly appreciated. If we have forgotten to mention or thank anyone, we sincerely regret it. Some of the people we met in Montana and Wyoming during this project were and are some of the nicest people we ever had the pleasure of meeting. Keith T. Werts and Stevan C. Booras, Spokane, Washington. Chapter 1. The Roots of War. The basis of the Great Lakota War was one of acquisition and conquest by the United States government. Almost from the moment the nation was founded, it was official government policy to confiscate or otherwise acquire traditional Indian land and to subjugate the inhabiting tribes. White immigrants had been traversing the plains since 1822 especially over the Santa Fe and Oregon trails. When immigrant numbers increased in the early 1860s, conflict between the two cultures increased. Within months of the end of the Civil War, whites began to migrate westward in even greater numbers than before. Previously, the whites had just passed through Indian land and did not stay. However, the new migration brought about the appropriation of traditional Plains Indian lands for the establishment of farms, cattle ranches, and communities. Miners invaded the Rocky Mountains to exploit the bountiful mineral wealth. The primary route to the Montana and Idaho gold and silver fields was the Bozeman Trail. The trail crossed the Powder River country, one of the prime hunting grounds for the Lakota and Cheyenne. With the white encroachment upon the tribal lands, traditional Indian food sources, such as the buffalo, were being destroyed. Governmental policies and general public sentiment were against the Indians. Whites knew how to exploit natural resources to create a new civilization and deemed their culture far superior to that of the Indian. Many white Christians viewed Indians as godless savages deserving nothing less than complete extermination. During the Civil War, the Department of the Army had neither the men nor the resources to deal with the hostile tribes of the northern plains. With the war concluded, thousands of soldiers were freed up and sent to the plains. In the summer of 1865, the U.S. Army began a campaign of extermination against the tribes inhabiting southeastern Montana and northeastern Wyoming territories. This operation, led by General Patrick E. Connor, failed miserably because the soldiers were ill-prepared and badly supplied. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne attacks and harassment forced the soldiers to withdraw in utter defeat. In January of 1866, the U.S. government decided to attempt a peaceful resolution to the conflict with the Sioux and the other Plains tribes. Runners were sent out to ask the leaders of the major tribes to come to Fort Laramie and to meet in council with government representatives. Red Cloud, the great Lakota leader, was one of the chiefs who decided to join the council with the Treaty Commission. Red Cloud was highly respected by not only the Lakota, but by the other Plains tribes as well. His decision to attend the council influenced the leaders of the other tribes to also attend. The U.S. government sought an agreement with the Indians that would allow whites the unmolested use of the Bozeman Trail. As the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribal leaders were engaged in the peace talks, a U.S. Army force of 2,000 soldiers arrived at Fort Laramie. Under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington, these soldiers were under orders to establish new forts along the Bozeman Trail, regardless of whether or not the Indians agreed. Enraged by this arrogant scheme, Red Cloud and the other Indian chiefs concluded that the white man's government could not be trusted. The Indians believed the whites were not interested in peace, but only wanted to steal Indian land through trickery or force. The Lakota and the other tribes struck their teepees and left Fort Laramie. It was the beginning of Chief Red Cloud's war. With the failure of the peace talks, Carrington and his soldiers set out to the north along the Bozeman Trail. When he reached Fort Reno, Carrington replenished the small force of soldiers left from the previous year and ventured further northward with the majority of his command. He established Fort Phil Kearny at the base of the Bighorn Mountains near present-day Story, Wyoming. A confederation of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho immediately challenged the soldiers, attacking them at almost every opportunity. Later in the summer of 1866, Carrington dispatched yet another part of his command northward into the Montana Territory. These soldiers constructed Fort C.F. Smith along the Bighorn River near present-day Fort Smith, Montana. Establishment of these forts proved worthless in safeguarding the Bozeman Trail. The soldiers had all they could to protect themselves, let alone any civilians who wanted to travel through the Powder River country. The Indian domination of the territory was so absolute that the soldiers were virtually prisoners in their own forts. Because the soldiers were under constant siege and could not accomplish their original mission of protecting the Bozeman Trail, the U.S. government had no choice but to abandon the forts and vacate the Powder River country. At the request of a new peace commission, The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders again assembled in 1868. This time, the adversaries negotiated the Fort Laramie Treaty. The new agreement supposedly gave the Indians absolute title to most of the northern plains, including the western half of present-day South Dakota. The area east of the Bighorn Mountains, north of the North Platte River, and west of the Missouri River was designated as unceded land. The tribes could continue to use the unceded land as their prime hunting ground. Under the terms of the treaty, white men were prohibited access to Indian lands without tribal permission, or so the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and other Plains tribes were led to believe. The treaty as written was intentionally so full of contradictions that it confused and frustrated the best legal minds of the day, but it gave the U.S. government what it wanted: peace, at least for the moment, with the Lakota and the other Northern Plains Indians. The government ignored much of the Fort Laramie Treaty. The Northern Pacific Railroad wanted to build a new railway across ceded Indian land and obtained the protection of the U.S. Army for its surveyors working along the Yellowstone River, even though this clearly violated the spirit of the treaty. In 1874, an Army expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer entered the Black Hills to explore and map the area. The expedition found gold, and within months, hundreds of white men were panning the mountain streams. The Black Hills expedition also violated the treaty. Pressure mounted on the Washington politicians to either buy or take the Black Hills from the Indians. The Lakota and Cheyenne repeatedly rejected offers to buy the Black Hills and other portions of their ceded land. Americans grew annoyed and impatient with the Indians' resistance. They viewed the heathen Indians as inferior beings, undeserving of title to such vast areas of natural resources. In 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant, Secretary of War William W. Belknap, and other government officials decided to unilaterally cancel the treaty and gave the Indians an ultimatum: return to their reservations by January 31, 1876, or face the wrath of the U.S. Army. The establishment of the reservation agency system by previous treaties caused the Indians to be classified into three separate groups: the agency Indians, the summer roamers, and the winter roamers. The agency Indians stayed at their agencies throughout the year. They attempted to follow the white man's way of life. The summer roamers spent most of the year at their respective agencies. It was at their assigned agency that they received allotments of food and other supplies from the government. However, they did leave their agencies during the summer to go hunting and to visit their non-reservation relatives. The winter roamers avoided the agencies altogether. They preferred to live in a strictly traditional manner. Word of the government ultimatum was transmitted to the Indian agents at all the 8 major agencies on December 6, 1875. The agents were instructed to inform all the tribes of the new demand. The Indians already at the agencies received the news at once. The winter roamers could not so easily be notified of the ultimatum, since they were hundreds of miles away in their winter camps along the tributaries of the Yellowstone River. Although the agents sent out tribal runners to deliver the ultimatum to the winter roamers, some of the bands did not receive the news until later the next spring, months after the deadline. The short timeline could be attributed to either bureaucratic short-sightedness or to political considerations on the part of the Grant administration, and it could be argued that it was both. The Lakota and most of the other nomadic tribes ignored the government's threat. They were not intimidated by an army they had whipped so many times before. When the spring of 1876 arrived, most of the summer roamers left their agencies to join their non-agency relatives. It was, after all, the season for buffalo hunts and tribal festivities. Having failed to achieve the Indians' capitulation, President Grant ordered the Army to take action. Lieutenant General Phil Sheridan, the commander of the Military Division of the Missouri, instructed General Alfred Terry, the commander of the Department of the Dakota, and General George Crook, the commander of the Department of the Platte, to begin an immediate military campaign against the Sioux and Northern Cheyenne. Chapter 2. Crook's Spring Campaign. Generals Alfred Terry and George Crook had received their orders. They were to begin an immediate and aggressive campaign against the Sioux and Cheyenne, who had failed to report to their agencies by January 31st, as ordered by the U.S. government. Most of the non-agency Sioux and Cheyenne were presumed to be camped along the major river drainages in eastern Montana, the Yellowstone, Powder, and Tongue rivers. General Crook, an experienced Indian fighter from the Apache War, planned to advance upwards through eastern Wyoming and attack from the south. General Terry planned to depart Fort Abraham Lincoln in present-day North Dakota and attack from the northeast. Crook and his men were already logistically prepared to make war. However, Terry was hindered by severe winter weather and was unable to quickly obtain adequate supplies and enough soldiers to mount a viable military operation. He informed Sheridan he could not start his campaign until the spring of 1876. Terry's delay did not stop General Crook. At age 48, Crook was an experienced Indian fighter. While unpretentious, he was confident he could rein in the Sioux and Cheyenne. On March 1, 1876, Crook and his command departed Fort Fetterman in Wyoming to look for the non-compliant Sioux and Cheyenne. His force of 900 men included 10 companies of the 2nd and 3rd Cavalries, under the command of Colonel Joseph J. Reynolds, and 2 companies of the 4th Infantry, under the command of Colonel Alexander Chambers. The 200 civilians with the command included scouts, packers, herders, and teamsters. Crook took along 86 wagons and 400 pack mules to carry supplies and forage. Colonel Thaddeus H. Stanton led the scouts, including Frank Grouard, Louis Richaud, Baptiste Big Bat, Poirier, Baptiste Little Bat, Garnier, and others recruited from the Red Cloud and Spotted Tail agencies. From the start, the soldiers had to deal with extremely harsh winter conditions. Scout Frank Grouard reported temperatures as low as -63 degrees on one evening in March. Indian scouting parties kept Crook's command under observation, and on their first night out, a small band of warriors attacked the command. One herder was seriously wounded during the short fight, and the command's small beef herd stampeded and lost, a critical provision which would be sorely missed. Crook's force continued northward and reached the Tongue River. His scouts went ahead and rode downstream all the way to the Yellowstone River in search of enemy tribes. They found no villages, but they did find numerous trails leading to the divide separating the Tongue and Powder rivers. On March 16th, Stanton and his scouts spied 2 warriors watching the command. They supposed the Indians were out hunting and were from an enemy camp not far away. This was the opportunity for Crook to strike a blow. The general dispatched Colonel Reynolds and 6 companies out on an overnight march to find and attack the village. Crook ordered Reynolds to rendezvous with the rest of the command along the Powder River following the attack. Reynolds' march over the divide was daunting because the terrain was extremely rough and treacherous. Both horses and men suffered greatly, and at times the ground was so icy the men had no choice but to dismount and walk. Scout Grouard followed the trail in the snow left by the Cheyenne hunters, and early on the morning of March 17th, he found the village on the bottomland near the left bank of the Powder River. The village was comprised of 100 teepees with 400 to 500 Cheyenne and a few Sioux. Groves of cottonwood trees enclosed the village. Precipitous sharp ridges and hills bordered the village to the northwest and north. The Reynolds Battle. The morning of March 17th was bitterly cold, but the soldiers were anxious for a fight. However, Colonel Reynolds seemed at a loss at what to do. Following Grouard's suggestions, he dispatched 2 companies under Captain Moore to take positions in the heights directly northwest of the village. Their mission was to prevent any escaping Indians from fleeing into the hills. Reynolds ordered Captain Egan and his company to proceed directly into the village and start the attack. Captain Anson Mills and his company were ordered to follow James Egan, then take possession of the village and destroy it. Captain Henry Noyes and his men were ordered to capture the Indians' pony herd and drive it upstream away from the village. An early morning fog shrouded the village. Most of the Cheyenne and Sioux were still asleep and warm inside their lodges. The three companies under Agan, Noyes, and Mills remained hidden as they rode quietly down a deep ravine west of the village. When they reached the bottomland along the river, Agan and Mills turned to the left, northeast, and trotted towards the village. Noyes went straight for the pony herd along the left bank of the river and soon had the herd head upstream to the southwest. Agan and his men charged into the village, firing their pistols into the teepees. At the first sounds of gunfire, the Cheyenne and Sioux awoke and scrambled out of their sleeping robes. Fleeing their lodges half-clothed, the warriors had only enough time to grab a few rifles and some bows and arrows. They rushed the women and children to safety in the high rocky ridges and crevices just to the north of the camp. Captain Moore and his men failed to establish their positions as ordered by Reynolds, and when the fight began, Moore could not prevent the Cheyenne from escaping into the ravines and ridges north of the village. The soldiers, having chased the Indians from their camp, burned and demolished everything in sight, including teepees, robes, clothing, food supplies, ammunition, and anything else deemed useful to the Cheyenne and Sioux. Since the soldiers were short of rations, some of them attempted to save the Indians' supply of dried meat to supplement their meager diet of hardtack. An irrational Colonel Reynolds ordered even that destroyed. With the women and children safely concealed, the warriors mounted a fierce counterattack. With few guns, most of the warriors had to use bows and arrows to fight the soldiers. However, the warriors fought gallantly. One Cheyenne used an old muzzle loader to shoot one soldier in the head. The Indians resolved to punish the soldiers for the sneak attack, and within minutes 4 soldiers were dead and 6 others lay wounded. Fearing more casualties and perhaps a humiliating defeat, Reynolds decided to retreat. In his haste for a speedy withdrawal, Reynolds abandoned his dead soldiers on the battlefield. This was an unconscionable act in the eyes of the junior officers and enlisted men. Worse, Reynolds allegedly abandoned one wounded soldier. His death at the hands of the angry warriors was likely prolonged and painful. The Cheyenne and Sioux lost only 1 dead and 1 wounded. In terms of casualties, the soldiers clearly had lost the fight. Reynolds and his men retreated up the Powder River to rejoin Crook and the rest of the command. While in camp that night, Reynolds left the captured pony herd virtually unguarded, and by the next morning, the Cheyenne and Sioux had snatched most of them back. With inadequate clothing and the temperature well below 0, the soldiers suffered horribly from the bitter cold. Many were stricken with frostbite. The soldiers wished they had saved the buffalo robes and the dried meat they had burned back at the Cheyenne village. With their limited rations all but gone, not even the wounded had any food to ease their hunger. The Cheyenne also suffered after the fight. They too had little food and inadequate clothing to keep them warm during the freezing nights. They walked for 4 days and finally found refuge in Crazy Horse's Oglala Sioux camp to the northeast and downstream along the Powder River. The Oglala took the destitute Cheyenne and Sioux into their lodges and treated them kindly, giving them both food and new clothing. The soldiers' attack made them bitter. Before the fight with Reynolds' soldiers, they had considered themselves somewhat friendly to the Wasichu, white men, but afterwards they considered them an enemy to be destroyed. When General Crook and his 4 companies joined Reynolds at the mouth of Lodgepole Creek, he was dismayed to learn the colonel had executed his orders in such a negligent and incompetent manner. Reynolds had lost the battle, left his dead soldiers on the battlefield, failed to salvage even a portion of the Indian foodstuffs for the starving men, and had lost the captured pony herd. With the severe shortage of rations and other supplies, Crook had no choice but to retreat to Fort Fetterman. The Army's hope for a quick resolution to the Indian problem had evaporated, and any further action against the Sioux and Northern Cheyenne had to wait until the following spring or summer. After the return to Fort Fetterman, Crook filed charges against Reynolds for his negligence during the attack on the Cheyenne village. Reynolds was court-martialed and convicted. He lost his rank and command for 1 year. However, he realized his reputation was tarnished and his career was essentially over. Reynolds retired from the Army soon after. Chapter 3. The Rosebud Battle. The same day Reynolds attacked the Cheyenne on the Powder River, more U.S. soldiers departed for the Powder River country. Known as the Montana Column, the newly comprised unit was assigned to the Department of the Dakota and included 5 companies of the 7th Infantry from Fort Shaw, 1 company of 7th Infantry from Fort Baker, and a battalion of the 2nd Cavalry from Fort Ellis. Colonel John Gibbon, commander of the Montana Column, joined the force on March 26, 1876, 9 days after his soldiers first departed on their expedition. General Alfred H. Terry, commander of the Department of the Dakota, ordered the unit to patrol along the Yellowstone River to prevent the Sioux and Cheyenne from fleeing north. Gibbon and his men spent most of the spring and summer patrolling the banks of the Yellowstone River between the mouths of the Bighorn and Tongue Rivers. Except for some minor skirmishes, they saw little action and sat waiting for General Terry's command to arrive from the Dakota Territory. General Terry's forces, consisting mostly of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry, finally left Fort Abraham Lincoln for the Montana Territory on May 17th. 3½ weeks later, Terry finally joined up with Colonel Gibbon's force along the Yellowstone River. Along with Crook's force, the soldiers of the Montana, Dakota, and Wyoming columns planned to attack the Sioux and Cheyenne from 3 directions. This pincer movement was designed to prevent the tribe's escape and force their surrender. While it may have been a 3-pronged plan of attack, Terry and Crook did not know exactly where each other's commands were. The 2 commands could only communicate via telegraph and courier, a process that took over 2 weeks to complete. With no means of rapid and direct communication, a coordinated attack was impossible. At noon on May 29, 1876, General Crook and the men of his command left Fort Fetterman for the trip up the Bozeman Trail, the same route taken the previous March. His military force was comprised of just over 1,000 soldiers and officers. Crook's command included 15 companies of the 2nd and 3rd Cavalries and 5 companies of 4th and 9th Infantries. Lieutenant Colonel William B. Royal was named overall commander of the cavalry companies. Major Alexander W. Evans was assigned command of the 10 3rd Cavalry companies, and Captain Henry Noyes placed in charge of the 5 companies of the 2nd Cavalry. Major Alexander Chambers was assigned the command of all the infantry companies. Crook took along just over 100 wagons with 100 teamsters and other employees to haul forage and supplies, and each wagon was pulled by 6 mules. Mr. Thomas Moore was in charge of the pack train that consisted of 81 packers and 250 mules for hauling additional supplies. To act as guides, Crook took along 3 white scouts, Frank Grouard, Louis Richaud, and Baptiste Big Bat Poirier. All 3 men were skillful guides and frontiersmen. Grouard had previously rendered exceptional service to Crook during the earlier March campaign. Crook's force, including soldiers and civilians, totaled about 1,300 men. 5 newspaper reporters tagged along, including John F. Finnerty of the Chicago Times. His bravery during the campaign earned him the great respect among the command's soldiers. They warmly referred to Finnerty as the fighting Irish pencil pusher. One civilian member of Crook's force turned out to be an amusing surprise, at least to most of the enlisted soldiers. When the command neared the abandoned Fort Reno site, one of the teamsters was discovered to be not a man, but a woman, the notorious Calamity Jane. While most of the men got a big chuckle out of it, Crook found no humor in having a woman along on the expedition. She was arrested and soon escorted back to Fort Fetterman. Crook planned to meet up with a large group of friendly Crow and Shoshone Indian scouts, previously recruited to support the command. The general valued the scouts, not only because of their familiarity with the Powder River country, but because they were also fearless combatants and enemies of the Sioux. Crook expected to meet the Crow Scouts near the old abandoned Fort Reno, But when the command reached the site, no crows were to be found. Concerned, Crook dispatched Gruard, Richaud, and Poirier to the Crow Indian Agency near present-day Livingston, Montana. The scouts were to ensure the Crow warriors joined the command as they had previously agreed. The three men departed on their perilous mission under cover of darkness, hoping to avoid the keen eye of any enemy scouts. Crook's intent was to meet the Shoshone scouts on the banks of Goose Creek near present-day Sheridan, Wyoming, but after passing the abandoned Fort Kearny site on June 6th, he took a wrong turn and followed Prairie Dog Creek for 18 miles. Finally realizing his mistake, Crook halted and bivouacked for the night. The next day, he curiously chose to continue north along Prairie Dog Creek and camp at its junction with the Tongue River. For reasons known only to Crook, he then decided to wait for the arrival of the friendly Indian scouts at the mouth of Prairie Dog Creek, a decision devoid of logic since his instructions to his scouts had been to meet him on Goose Creek. The command reached the confluence of Prairie Dog Creek and the Tongue River on June 7th. The terrain was rugged, and sagebrush covered most of the surrounding area. The campsite sat upon a flat near dense stands of cottonwood trees along the south bank of the Tongue. The site also offered plenty of good grass for the horses and mules to eat. Lieutenant John Bourke later lamented, "Mosquitoes became troublesome near the watercourses, and the heat of the sun became almost unbearable." On the other hand, he fondly recalled, when clouds later rolled in to cool things down, the heavy arch of clouds supported itself upon the crests of the bluffs enclosing the valley of our camp. It was a pretty picture. The parks of wagons and pack mules, the bright rows of tentage, and the moving animals and men gave enough animation to relieve the otherwise too somber view of the elements of war. The soldiers relaxed as the Tongue's clear, cold waters passed gently by. On June 8th, a group of 65 Montana miners met up with the command. The miners had intended to go to the Black Hills, but with the large number of unfriendly Sioux and Cheyenne roaming along their route, they decided it was safer to join up with Crook. Hardened veterans of the frontier, the miners were a valuable addition to the command. While relaxing in the early evening hours of June 9th, the soldiers observed two mounted Cheyenne warriors riding back and forth along the rim of the high rocky bluffs just north of camp. The warriors' bravado was an apparent challenge to the soldiers to chase them. Many other warriors, not initially seen by the command, spread out along and near the very edge of the cliffs, partially hidden by the dense sagebrush, and with the clear advantage of being directly above Crook's camp. They fired their .44 Henry and .50 caliber rifles into Crook's campsite. The Cheyenne shot at the soldiers, their horses and mules, and into many of the camp's tents. No doubt they hoped to find an unlucky soldier taking a nap. Another small band had remained hidden to the east of Crook's camp. They planned to come from behind and steal some horses, while the soldiers' attention was diverted. Crook ordered an attack. Captains Andrew Burt, Samuel Munson, and Thomas Booras took their 3 infantry companies and crossed the Tongue. After wading through the river's frigid water, they scaled the nearly vertical bluffs on the right of the command. Crook also dispatched A, E, I, and M companies of the 3rd Cavalry under Captain Anson Mills. Mills took his force and crossed the Tongue just to the west, and after reaching a grove of cottonwood trees, the cavalry dismounted. Right along with the troopers went the pencil-pushing Finnerty. Leaving every 4th man to hold the horses, they charged on foot up the bluffs. After a struggle to reach the top, the soldiers charged in formation and quickly drove the Cheyenne back to a small ridgeline about 1/2 mile to the north. The soldiers were elated to see the warriors beat a hasty retreat. But once the Cheyenne passed the crest of a plateau, they suddenly turned and fired another volley at the pursuing soldiers. A barrage of lead stopped the soldiers, but again they charged and pushed the Cheyenne back to another ridge. The Indians fired another volley or two and then escaped on their ponies to the north. No soldiers were injured in the fight, except for 2 minor wounds. The soldiers seemed to have rather enjoyed the skirmish, since it relieved the boredom they endured in their otherwise mundane life in bivouac. Since the soldiers' mounts were well secured, the Cheyenne suffered only a lost opportunity to steal some horses. After the fight on Prairie Dog Creek, Crook moved the command over to Goose Creek as originally planned. A few days later, Grouard and the other scouts, having been absent nearly 2 weeks, showed up with 175 crows. Civilian scout Tom Cosgrove and 86 Shoshone warriors arrived shortly thereafter to further bolster Crook's fighting force. With the arrival of his Indian auxiliary, Crook was finally ready to move against the Sioux and Cheyenne. All of June 15th was spent preparing for the march north. Crook ordered Major Chambers to mount his infantrymen on mules so the infantry could keep up with the cavalry. Although much chagrined, Chambers assembled his 175 amateur equestrians for an introduction to the joys of mule riding. The mules, unaccustomed to human cargo, reacted predictably. Scout Grouard described the show. "I never saw so much fun in all my life. The valley for a mile in every direction was filled with bucking mules, frightened infantrymen, broken saddles, and applauding spectators. Having nothing else to do, the entire command took a half-holiday to enjoy the sport, and some of the most ludicrous mishaps imaginable were witnessed. But the average soldier is persevering as the mule is stubborn, and in the end, the mule was forced to submit. Crook, in the interest of expediting his movements, decided to leave the wagon train behind at Goose Creek. On the morning of June 16th, the general departed for the Rosebud with a force of 1,325 men. The officers and men brought along only the barest necessities. Each carried only 4 days of rations, hardtack, bacon, and coffee, 1 blanket, their weapons, a Springfield Model 1873 rifle for the infantry, a Springfield Model 1873 carbine for the cavalry, and a .45 caliber Colt revolver. Ammunition for the Colt revolver and 100 cartridges for their Springfield rifle or carbine. Crook still did not know where the main camps of the Sioux and Cheyenne were. Grouard later stated, "From all signs I had seen, I supposed they were on Rosebud Creek, and I so informed him." Crook's scouts, Indian or white, could not provide him with any worthwhile intelligence regarding the location of the Sioux and Cheyenne camps. Crook's command rode northeastward, traversing terrain broken by ravines and small tributaries of the Tongue River. They climbed rolling hills and passed sandstone cliffs. While cactus and sagebrush dominated the terrain, grass was also plentiful. Along the way, the command encountered large herds of buffalo. This was a temptation the Indian allies could not ignore. The Crow and Shoshone warriors began shooting and killing the buffalo by the dozens. Not wanting to alert the Sioux and Cheyenne of the command's presence, an angry Crook ordered the friendly scouts to stop firing their weapons. The Crows and Shoshones ignored the general's admonition and continued the slaughter. As far as the Indian scouts were concerned, better kill buffalo than have him feed the Sioux. The command turned northward and followed Spring Creek up the divide between the Tongue and Rosebud Creek. Upon reaching the higher elevations, scrub pines topped the rocky crests and gave contrast to the otherwise bleak and rugged landscape. After crossing the divide, Crook set up camp for the night at the headwater of Rosebud Creek's South Fork. The camp was set up in the form of a rectangle and surrounded a marsh-like lake. The cavalry took up 3 sides of the rectangle and left the other side for Chambers' infantry that trailed a few miles behind. Mills described the hilarity surrounding Chambers' arrival with the Mule Brigade. No sooner had the mules halted when, after their custom, they began to bray as loud as they could, making extra effort in accord with the extra effort they had made to carry their strange burden into camp. The cavalry officers and troopers began to roar with laughter, and Chambers lost courage, and with oaths and every evidence of anger, threw his sword down on the ground and left the command to take care of itself as best it could. On June 14th, the largest group of the Sioux and Cheyenne winter roamers, under Sitting Bull, were camped along the banks of the Rosebud, only a little over 50 miles from Crook's campsite on Goose Creek. By June 16th, they had moved their 450 lodges about 15 miles west to a new site along Ash Creek, now named Reno Creek, a minor tributary of the Little Bighorn River. At the same time, a much smaller group of summer roamers, led by Cheyenne chiefs Magpie Eagle and American Horse, set up a temporary camp on Trail Creek near Sitting Bull's recently vacated Rosebud Creek campsite near present-day Busby, Montana. This group planned to join the larger camp on Reno Creek. The tribal chief sent Little Hawk, the same Cheyenne warrior at the Prairie Dog Creek fight, and 4 other Elk Society members to spy on the soldiers. When Little Hawk's party accidentally found the soldiers nearing the South Fork of the Rosebud, they rode back to the village and reported it to the chiefs. When the Sioux and Cheyenne at the village received the news, the primary chiefs held a big council. They decided to take no action against the soldiers for the time being. Wooden Leg later stated the chiefs sent a herald around the village to announce, "Young men, leave the soldiers alone unless they attack us." Little Hawk led one large party of both Sioux and Cheyenne warriors out of the village on Reno Creek, not long after dark. They were the first group to leave the camp on Reno Creek and rode through the Wolf Mountains and headed directly towards the place on the Rosebud where he had last seen Crook's soldiers. Not long after, many of the other young Sioux and Cheyenne warriors disregarded their elders' admonition, and they too sneaked out in small groups, rode across the Wolf Mountains, and headed towards the forks of Rosebud Creek. As they rode through the night, the smaller groups of warriors joined up with other Sioux and Cheyenne to form larger bands. Young Two Moon led a large party of Cheyenne and Sioux warriors from the Reno Creek camp, including a young woman named Buffalo Calf Road Woman. The sister of Chief comes in sight. Instead of riding across the Wolf Mountains, they rode eastward to the camp of Magpie Eagle, an American Horse. Early in the morning, many of the warriors from this village joined up with young Two Moon's group, which now numbered about 200. This combined group of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors rode up Rosebud Creek and traveled as fast as they could to join the other warrior groups. However, when they neared the mouth of Trail Creek, about 12 miles north of the Big Bend, some Cheyenne soldiers stopped young Two Moon's group. Little Hawk had told these soldiers to prevent any warriors from riding up the Rosebud, since Crook's force was probably riding in the opposite direction. Not long after daybreak, young Two Moon sent out 4 scouts, 2 Sioux and 2 Cheyenne, to look for any soldiers. Not long after the scouts' departure, young Two Moon's group again set out towards the bends of Rosebud Creek. Early in the morning of June 17, Crook's command broke camp and continued their march. They rode along both banks of the Rosebud's South Fork, and after a 3-mile ride, ran into the North Fork entering the valley from the west. At the point where the forks met, the creek began to flow eastward. This point is now called the West Bend. 3 miles further east, the creek channel shifted abruptly northward. This is now referred to as the East Bend, or the Big Bend. The command rode eastward along both banks of Rosebud Creek. The Rosebud Valley was beautiful compared with much of the country the command had traversed since leaving Goose Creek. The valley floor was covered with emerald-colored grass, and wild roses grew along the banks of Rosebud Creek. At 8 a.m., the command reached the midpoint between the west and east bends of Rosebud Creek. Crook ordered a halt to allow the horses and men to rest. To the south, a 3-mile-long ridge paralleled the flow of the creek. The ridge's highest crest stood 300 feet above the valley floor. A series of low bluffs bordered the creek to the north, with higher ridges and tableland beyond. 2 gaps cut through the northern terrain. The western gap was a narrow valley through which ran a 2-mile-long creek, now named Colmar Creek, and one gap on the east side was a wide and mile-long depression that ran northward, now called the Sioux Gap. The command rested along both banks of the Rosebud. The 3rd Cavalry occupied the right bank of the creek, with Captain Mills' companies A, E, I, and M in the lead. Also along the right bank following Mills were Captain Frederick Van Vliet's companies C and G and Captain Guy Henry's companies B, D, F, and L. On the other bank, north of the creek, and in the lead were Captain Henry Noyes' 2nd Cavalry companies A, B, D, E, and I. Following Noyes was Major Chambers' Mule Brigade, companies D and F of the 4th Infantry and companies C, G, and H of the 9th Infantry. Also on the left bank were the Packers and Miners. The length of the column was quite long, and since the Packers were at the tail end of the column, some lagged far behind the rest of the command. In fact, some of the Packers were still coming into bivouac when the battle started. Most of the soldiers unsaddled their horses and mules to let them graze. Some of the men took the opportunity to lie down for some much-needed sleep, while others started campfires to make coffee and visit with their comrades. Crook posted a few lookouts on the bluffs just to the north of camp, and then began a game of cards with some junior officers. While most of the soldiers relaxed, a few Crow and Shoshone scouts rode north into the surrounding hills to look for signs of the enemy. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors had ridden all night to find the soldiers. The group, led by Little Hawk, stopped just before sunrise and rested in the hills, only a few miles to the north of Crook's force. Other separate warrior bands also stopped just north of Rosebud Creek and prepared for combat. They painted their horses' flanks with symbolic patterns and dressed themselves in fine clothing suitable for a warrior in battle. Some placed special ornaments or charms upon their person. They believed their sacred objects had medicinal powers and would give them courage or protect them in battle. Crook's, Crow, and Shoshone scouts rode directly north, and about 10 miles north of the bivouac, the Crows ran headlong into the 4 Sioux and Cheyenne scouts, riding in the opposite direction. The two groups exchanged some rifle shots, but soon the Crows and Shoshone fled back towards Crook's bivouac. As the fleeing scouts sped south, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors peppered them with lead. The warriors of young Two Moon's group, which by then had left the Rosebud Valley and were following their 4 scouts through the hills, heard the gunfire between the opposing scouting parties. They sped off over the hills to help their comrades. Back along Rosebud Creek, the command heard distant gunfire to the north. At first, some of the soldiers wondered if the Indian scouts were shooting buffalo, but within minutes the Crows and Shoshone scouts raced in yelling, "Lakota! Lakota!" The time was 8:30 a.m., and the Battle of the Rosebud had begun. Little Hawk's band heard the exchange of rifle shots between the Sioux and Cheyenne scouts and the Crow and Shoshone scouts. They mounted their horses and sped south towards the Rosebud. Little Hawk's warriors would be the first to attack the soldiers. Young Two Moon's band soon joined them. 1,000 warriors thundered towards Crook's command. Among the Sioux war leaders were Crazy Horse and Rain in the Face. Little Hawk, Young Two Moon, and Spotted Wolf led most of the Cheyenne. Other prominent war chiefs led latecomers from both tribes. The warriors attacked Crook's command from every direction. The heaviest assault came in a 3-prong attack from the north, with the largest number of Sioux and Cheyenne in a charge through Sioux Gap. The sudden attack surprised General Crook, and because of his location below the bluffs, he could not fully see what was happening. Although greatly outnumbered, the fearless Shoshone and Crow scouts, under Captain George Randall, rode up onto the bluffs north of the command and mounted a fierce counterattack. For 20 minutes, the fighting was back and forth, charges meeting counter-charges. Only the Indian allies' quick action saved Crook's command from being overwhelmed. Major Alexander Evans realized the gravity of the situation and began to issue orders to deploy the various companies. Led by Major Chambers and Captain Avery Kane, the 5 companies of the 4th and 9th Infantry and Captain Noyes, B, E, and I, companies of the 2nd Cavalry marched dismounted up onto the plateau north of the command to support the pickets and the Indian allies. Captain Thomas Dewey's Company, A of the 2nd Cavalry, remained along the Rosebud to hold the mounts of the attacking infantry and cavalry. With Noyes' 2nd Cavalry on the right flank, the combined force spread out along the northern bluffs between Colmar Creek and Sioux Gap, and readied for the expected assault by the Sioux and Cheyenne. Captain Van Vliet took Companies C and G of the 3rd Cavalry up on the long ridge to the south. The captain and his 2 companies soon engaged and drove off a small band of warriors approaching from the east. Van Vliet remained on this ridge for 2 hours and prevented any enemy attack at the rear of Crook's command. Early in the fight, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors gathered in large numbers on the hills just to the north of Crook's bivouac, and soon began a bold attack on the soldiers in the valley. Lieutenant Bourke later described the action when he wrote, "As the hostiles advanced at a full run, they saw nothing in their front and imagined that it would be an easy thing for them to sweep down through the long ravine leading to the amphitheater, where they could see numbers of our cavalry horses clumped together." Bourke continued, "When Kane's men and the detachments of the 2nd Cavalry, which were lying down behind a low range of knolls, rose up and delivered a withering fire at less than 150 yards, the Sioux turned and fled as fast as Quirt and Heel could persuade their ponies to get out of there. Although they had thwarted the Sioux and Cheyenne frontal assault, Kane's and Noyes companies soon began to receive an enfilading fire on both their right and left flanks. To stop the assault on the right flank, Captain Mills was ordered to take companies A, E, K, and M to attack and dislodge a large group of dismounted Sioux and Cheyenne gathered on a rugged and boulder-strewn ridge at the east side and at the mouth of Sioux Gap. Mills' mounted troopers crossed the Rosebud and charged directly at the warriors only a few hundred yards away. The Sioux and Cheyenne established positions on the east slope just below the crest of the ridge. They hid behind sandstone boulders and pine trees and used their .44 Henry repeating rifles to rain bullets down on Mills' companies approaching from the southwest. A few cavalrymen swung over to the east side of the ridge and attacked the warriors' left flank and backside. After reaching the ridge, the troops dismounted, rushed forward, and showed great courage in the face of heavy fire. Unable to withstand the troopers' tenacious assault, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors jumped on their horses and made a hasty retreat. The warriors soon joined other warriors gathering in Sioux Gap and in the hills to the northwest. John F. Finnerty, who accompanied Mills' troops during the charge, later wrote, "We went like a storm, and the Indians waited for us until we were within 50 paces. We were going too rapidly to use our carbines, with what effect I could neither then nor afterward determine, for all passed like a flash of lightning or a dream. Having driven the Indians away, Mills's troops again mounted their horses and pursued the fleeing warriors towards another ridge about 1 mile to the northwest, now known as Crook's Hill or Crook's Ridge. For a while, the action was back and forth, charge meeting countercharge. A few warriors made such runs at the pursuing soldiers. Comes in sight made many bravery runs. He charged at the soldiers and rode back and forth in front of them to draw their fire. During one of his individual acts of bravery, the Cheyenne warrior had his horse shot out from under him. The warrior kept his composure and walked away, seemingly oblivious to the danger. Comes in Sight's life was in great peril. The nearby troopers and Crook's Indian scouts fired many bullets at him. If not for the action of his sister, Comes in Sight would have been killed. Buffalo Calf Road woman swiftly rode her horse down into Sioux Gap to save her brother. She enjoined Comes in Sight to mount the back of her horse, and with bullets hitting all around them, the brother and sister rode back to the north to safely join the other warriors. From then on, The Cheyenne referred to the battle as "where the girl saved her brother." Mills' troops continued to chase the warriors northwest bound, and the combined force of the 4th and 9th Infantry and 2nd Cavalry continued to slowly push the warriors in the hills back further to the north. However, it was a charge by Mills' cavalry companies that finally succeeded in driving off the warriors. The Sioux and Cheyenne again fled to the northwest, this time to a high conical hill a little over a half-mile away. This hill is now known as Conical Hill. After Mills had taken control of Crook's Ridge, Chambers and Noyes companies soon joined him. Not long afterwards, General Crook established his command post on the ridge, and he would remain there throughout the remainder of the battle. To stop the attack on the command's left flank, Lieutenant Colonel Royal took Companies B, I, and L, 3rd Cavalry, and joined up with Captain Henry's Companies D and F, 3rd Cavalry. Together, they attacked a large group of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors gathered on top of a long ridge north of Rosebud Creek and near the West Bend. This ridge is now known as Royal Ridge. The 5 cavalry companies drove the warriors back and chased them to the northwest along the ridge. Although the warriors were in apparent retreat, they stopped occasionally to fire their rifles and carbines at the pursuing cavalry. Royal continued to drive the warriors to the northwest, from one ridge to another, not stopping until they had almost reached the head of Colmar Creek. The warriors had succeeded in getting Royal and his cavalry to do exactly what they had apparently wanted. They had lured Royal away from the main command under Crook, and planned to surround his pursuing cavalry after it became isolated. While some of the warriors driven from Crook's Ridge joined other Sioux and Cheyenne fighters already gathered on Conical Hill, many of the others joined their comrades who had been driven northwest by Royal. Still others rode to the northwest and established positions on a long ridge bordering Colmar Creek on the north. From Conical Hill, the Sioux and Cheyenne took long-range shots at soldiers atop Crook's Ridge. Crook dispatched Tom Moore and his packers, along with some of the Montana miners, to establish defensive positions on the northwestern area of the ridge. The civilian sharpshooters hid behind large sandstone rock formations a half-mile from the Conical Hill, now known as Packers Rocks, and countered with a heavy barrage of their own. Firing primarily .50 caliber sharp sporters, the civilian sharpshooters not only held the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors at bay, but also prevented the enemy from inflicting any real damage upon the men with Crook. About a mile after he had left the valley, Royal observed a smaller group of warriors gathered atop a pine-covered, flat-topped ridge directly to the west. Lieutenant James Foster, with 18 men from Company I, split off to the left from Royal to attack the warriors on the ridge, now known as Foster's Ridge. Royal and his remaining men continued northwest bound, chased the Indians to another ridge further west, and just to the south of the headwaters of Colmar Creek. Royal's men dismounted and took up positions on the south slope and east end of the half-mile-long ridge. This ridgeline, now known as Royal's first position, is over a mile away from Crook's Hill. Some of the troopers crept 100 yards further westward along the ridge, but stayed on the south slope for protection from the Sioux and Cheyenne gunfire coming from the north and the west, as Royal's cavalry companies took possession of the ridge's east end. The Sioux and Cheyenne in the hills north of Colmar Creek fired long-distance shots at the force. Other warriors fled to the opposite end of the ridge, 1,000 yards west of Royal. Other Sioux and Cheyenne continued past the west end and in an arcing movement went to the ridges southwest of Royal. Leaving Royal's first position, Captain William Andrews took a platoon of 18 men and rode westward along the crest of the ridge. They dismounted and halted at an outcropping of boulders crowning the ridge 700 yards from Royal. These rocks are now known as Andrews Point. From Andrews Point, the platoon fired their Springfield Point .45 and .55 carbines at the swarms of Indians gathered in numerous pockets to the north and west and southwest. Hidden behind boulders and small knolls as close as a quarter-mile away, the Sioux and Cheyenne fired hundreds of rounds at Andrews and his men. From his vantage point high atop the ridge, Andrews observed Foster and his men on the flat-topped ridge a half-mile to the south. Andrews also saw that the Sioux and Cheyenne had begun to attack Foster's small platoon from the west. With so few men, the lieutenant was in big trouble and was barely able to repel the warriors' attack. Andrews dispatched Private Weaver and ordered Foster's platoon to retreat and rejoin Royale's companies at the east end of the ridge. With a cover of carbine fire from the troopers at Andrews Point, Foster and his men retreated northward across the valley, dividing the ridge he had just abandoned and the ridge occupied by Andrews and Royal. Pursued by the attacking warriors and raked by an enfilading fire from the warriors along the ridges to the west, Foster and his men barely escaped. Foster's platoon, including 2 wounded troopers, rejoined Royal at the east end of the ridge. After Foster's retreat, some of the Sioux and Cheyenne took up new positions in the valley south of Andrews Point. These warriors fired their rifles and carbines from behind small knolls, only a few hundred yards away from Andrews and Royal. With Royal and the rest of his troops far from any support by Crook's force, the Sioux and Cheyenne went on the offensive. From atop high ridges to the north and west, and from their new positions to the south, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors surrounded Royale in the shape of a horseshoe. Andrews' platoon was especially vulnerable to the withering fire of the warriors, and they too soon abandoned their position atop the ridge to rejoin Royal at the east end. As soon as Andrews retreated, the Sioux and Cheyenne followed and took possession of the high rocky point. Raked by gunfire from both the south and west, Royal had no choice but to abandon his position. Concerned that Royal had strayed too far from the rest of the command, Crook ordered him to rejoin the main force on Crook's Ridge. However, Royal was under such heavy enemy fire that he could only afford to send one company, Captain Meinhold's Company B, back to reunite with Crook. Meinhold and his men took heavy fire from the warriors north of Colmar Creek. 1 soldier was wounded and 1 horse was killed during the retreat. With Meinhold's departure, all Royal could do was slowly retreat to the next ridgeline, a quarter-mile directly southeast, now designated Royal's second position. Royal and his troopers crossed the swale between the 2 ridges on foot. The soldiers spread out and took up new positions along the west end and south slope of the ridge. Andrews and Vroom's 2 companies took up protected positions just below the crest of the ridge, faced north and northwest, and fired at the enemy warriors who by then occupied the same ridge, just vacated by the troopers. Captain Guy Henry took companies D and F and formed a new skirmish line 100 yards southwest of Andrews and Vroom. From their new position near a flat-topped and large sandstone formation, they fought off warriors trying to attack Royale's left flank from the west and southwest. The Sioux and Cheyenne closed in on Royal and attacked with even greater boldness, again from every direction but the east. Royal's predicament grew worse as the warriors drew ever nearer. The Indians fired round after round at the troops, and since Royal's second position was barren of both trees and rocks, the soldiers had no protection at all from the Sioux and Cheyenne bullets coming from the west and south. One group of warriors had established a position on a low ridge only a half-mile south of Royal, and fired dozens of rounds at the cavalry's back. As Royal was engaged on the ridges to the west, 3 infantry companies under Captains Kane, Munson, and Loon were ordered to drive the warriors off Conical Hill. With apparently little resistance from the warriors, the soldiers took possession of the hill for the remainder of the battle. Driven from Conical Hill, many of the warriors joined other Sioux and Cheyenne attacking Royal and his companies. General Crook believed the main Sioux and Cheyenne village was located only miles to the northeast and up the Rosebud Canyon. With his success in having driven off the Sioux and Cheyenne from Crook's Ridge, the general decided on a new strategy. He would put the enemy on the defensive by attacking the village. He ordered Captain Mills to form up 3 companies of the 3rd Cavalry, A, E, and M, for the planned assault on the village. Mills took his troopers from Crook's Ridge and rode south back down to the area of the morning bivouac. After Royal abandoned his first position, the Sioux and Cheyenne took possession of the entire ridge, and other enemy warriors gathered in the valley of Colmar Creek just to the north of Royal. Having sensed the warriors had formed to begin a new attack on Royal's left flank and front from the north, Crook ordered his friendly Indian scouts on the attack. With the Shoshone led by Lieutenant Bourke and the Crows led by Captain Randall, the force left Crook's Ridge and rode down into the valley of Colmar Creek. They formed a line with Bourke on the right flank and Randall on the left and rapidly charged up the valley. The scouts' fierce attack forced most of the enemy warriors to retreat westward, but a small force of Sioux made a counterattack through a gap in the ridge north of Colmar Creek, now known as Sioux and Shoshone Gap. The combatants fought each other in hand-to-hand combat, but the outnumbered Sioux soon fled westward up the valley. The Crow and Shoshone scouts continued to charge and drove the Sioux and Cheyenne out of the valley, off the ridge previously held by Royal and Andrews, and back to another ridge just to the west of the headwater of Colmar Creek. At some point during the charge against the Sioux and Cheyenne, Lieutenant Bourke and trumpeter Elmer Snow rode over to the high point previously occupied by Andrews. From there, Bourke could see the trouble Royal's force was in. Bourke later noted that a force of not less than 500 warriors had massed for an attack on Royal's cavalry. Although the Crow and Shoshone scouts had succeeded in driving the Sioux and Cheyenne from the valley, they soon realized the enemy warriors had gained reinforcements and had gathered to begin a countercharge. The Indian scouts realized they were far outnumbered, and without orders, they began a hasty retreat back to Crook's Ridge. Lieutenant Bourke and Snow, still at Andrews Point, found themselves isolated and abandoned. The Sioux and Cheyenne charged and nearly caught them, but after firing his weapon at the warriors, they made a mad dash off the ridge. After leaving the ridge, Trumpeter Snow's horse became temporarily uncontrollable and took the rider towards the Sioux and Cheyenne positions. Snow gained some control over the mount, started back to his own lines, but was shot in both arms during his retreat. Without the use of his arms, Snow had only his legs to direct his horse, and he barely escaped with his life. Bourke later wrote of Snow, "He displayed noticeable gallantry and was desperately wounded in both arms, which were crippled for life." His escape from the midst of the enemy was a remarkable thing. Unlike the rest of the scouts and men who had made the charge with Bourke and Randall, Sergeant John Van Mall had gone into the fight without a horse. When Randall and Bourke's scouts retreated, the long-legged sergeant ran for his life back towards Crook's Ridge. A dozen enemy warriors rode towards Van Mall and had him nearly surrounded when help arrived from one of Crook's Indian scouts, a small but brave warrior known as Humpy. According to newspaperman John Finnerty, one small misshapen Crow and Shoshone warrior dashed in among the Sioux against whom Van Mall was dauntlessly defending himself, seized the big sergeant by the shoulder, and motioned him to jump up behind. Before the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors could react, Van Mall and the little Shoshone scout escaped back to their battalion. Royal and his troopers had been under a continuous siege for 2 hours and were still far from any support Crook could provide. After the Crows and Shoshone had driven the Sioux and Cheyenne up Colmar Creek, many of the enemy warriors again shifted their attention to Royal's command. With the increased number of Sioux and Cheyenne to hold back, Royal had no choice but to retreat to the next ridgeline a half-mile east. The 2 companies under Andrews and Vroom, still at their positions just below the crest of the ridge and on the south slope, provided protective cover, while the 2 other companies under Henry remounted their horses to lead the retreat. Andrews and Vroom's troopers soon abandoned their position and followed Henry. All 4 companies rode quickly eastward and remained on the ridge's south slope for protection from the warriors' bullets. They soon came to a roughly quarter-mile gap between the two ridges. When they reached the gap, some of the troopers rode slightly to the left so as to cross over to the north slope of the next ridge to the east and went just to the south of Colmar Creek. We have termed it the North Slope route. Some of the troopers rode straight ahead and ended up on the south slope of the next ridge, the South Slope route. Warriors attacked Royals troopers on the North Slope route from the west and the north. One of the assaults came from 6 Cheyenne warriors just 50 yards north of the soldiers' route. The warriors included Young Two-Moon and Limpy, and they fought from behind a small sandstone formation near the south bank of Colmar Creek. A Sioux warrior yelled a warning to the Cheyenne that some soldiers were about ready to attack them from behind. One by one, they mounted their horses to flee across Colmar Creek and to the ridge directly to the north. All the warriors got away except for Limpy. In Cheyenne memories, the warrior's plight is described. This crippled man. Limpy was last, and he waited until all the rest had gone. Then just as he was ready to start, his horse was shot. It stampeded, kicking, and bucked him off and fell. At first, Limpy took cover behind the sandstone formation, but then remembered he had not taken his horse's bridle. The bridle had some silver dollars mounted on it, and it was a cherished gift from his uncle. The other warriors would have considered Limpy a coward if he left the bridle, so he ran to his horse to retrieve it. Some of Crook's Indian scouts saw that Limpy was alone and without a horse, and rode down to count coup or to kill him. Young Two-Moon saw Limpy was in trouble, and at great peril to himself, rode back to save him. Young Two-Moon soon reached Limpy, but the enemy's bullets were thick and hit all around them. Young Two-Moon's horse became nearly unmanageable due to all the lead hitting near them, and because of his deformity, Limpy could not easily jump onto the back of the horse. He ran to some nearby rocks and climbed on top. Young Two-Moon swung his horse around, and this time Limpy was able to jump onto the back of the horse. The two warriors quickly rode away to safety. It was truly a great act of honor and bravery on the part of young Two-Moon. While Royal's retreat from his second to the third position was orderly, was also conducted with great haste, under constant fire and pressured by the warriors' hot pursuit. Some of the troopers apparently fled as fast as their horses could carry them. A number of troopers showed great courage and attempted to hold the pursuing warriors at bay. During the retreat, these brave men halted at 40 to 50-yard intervals to reload their carbines. Each time they stopped, they wheeled their horses around and fired a shot or two at the pursuing warriors. Due to the rapidity of the retreat, or perhaps because of panic on the part of a few individual troopers, some of them dropped live ammunition when they attempted to reload their Springfield carbines. When the troopers using the South Slope route neared the beginning of the next ridgeline, most of them passed just below and to the south of a prominent high point at the very west end of the ridge. The authors have dubbed it the Small Conical Hill. They rode up a slight incline at the base of the hill and up onto a long, flat-topped ridge that ran in a southeasterly direction. This ridge is now known as Royal Ridge, or Royal's third position. The ridge continued for nearly a mile and ended only when it neared Crook's morning campsite in the valley of Rosebud Creek. Some of the troopers who used the South Slope route did not immediately ride up to the crest of the ridge. Instead, they stayed below the southwest slope and did not ride up to the crest until reaching a ravine nearly 400 yards past the Small Conical Hill. Having ridden only a few hundred yards along the top of the ridge, the troopers of the four companies dismounted, spread out by companies, and faced west and north to establish new skirmish lines. While most of the enlisted men fought on foot, the company commanders and other officers remained mounted to quickly direct the movements of their men. Every fourth trooper took control of the dismounted horses and led them eastward down the long slope, across Colmar Creek, and into a deep ravine to keep them from being captured by the Sioux and Cheyenne. This ravine is now known as Lead Horse Ravine. Royal now had only about 150 officers and men to fight off over 500 enemy warriors. While closer to Crook's main force, the wide and deep gap of Colmar Creek still separated Royal's men from Crook. Some of the troopers took up a position along the very southwestern rim of the ridge and fired over a dozen rounds at the oncoming Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Most of the troopers formed up atop and on the center of the ridge. They spread out in ragged skirmish lines over 300 yards long and faced west and southwest. The ridge offered no large rock formations to hide behind, and except for the nearly 2-foot-high sagebrush running along most of the ridge's center, the soldiers were totally exposed to their enemies' bullets. The Sioux and Cheyenne attack was even more ferocious than before. Large numbers of warriors took up positions along the entire southwest slope of the ridge, and were only yards from the soldiers' positions. Sioux and Cheyenne by the hundreds closed in on Royal, again from every direction but the east. The warriors were so near the troopers that they shot arrows and fired their rifles at nearly point-blank range. The fighting on this slope was the most intense of the battle, and perhaps the heaviest hand-to-hand combat ever between the army and the Indians. Not only did the soldiers have to deal with the warriors at their front, the Sioux and Cheyenne flanked them on both their right and left. At times, the troopers shifted their lines to face north or south in order to meet an oncoming attack. To show their bravery, a few warriors rode their mounts right into the thick of the soldiers atop the ridge. From another ridge only a half-mile to the south, warriors fired dozens of rounds at Royal's troops. Other warriors located themselves on a protected slope just to the north of Royal's troops, and they too poured in heavy rifle fire at the soldiers. Far outnumbered, Royal's troops began to suffer more and more casualties. Troopers that would otherwise have stayed and fought were instead detailed to carry their wounded comrades off the ridge and over to the field hospital on Crook's Ridge. Soon, only about 60 or 70 troopers were left on the ridge to fight. In short order, the warriors outnumbered Royal's force by as much as 10 to 1. Against such odds, it looked as if Royal's troops were going to be nearly annihilated. A retreat had to be made, and quickly. Crook sent his Shoshone and Crow scouts across Colmar Creek to rescue Royal's dwindling force. To further support a retreat by Royal, Captains Burt and Burroughs infantry companies established positions just across from and east of Royal. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors pressed the fight in so close that some of the troopers panicked. Most of Royal's men fought with tremendous bravery. Captain Vroom and his company attempted to hold the warriors back, so the rest of Royal's men could escape across the deep ravine, separating them from Crook. But an overpowering force of Sioux and Cheyenne quickly surrounded the company and forced them into a protective circle. Captain Henry observed the peril Vroom's company was in, so he and his company hastened back to the crest of the ridge to help. Henry's company drove the warriors back from the crest, but not before Vroom had lost 5 men killed and 3 wounded. In Warpath and Bivouac, Finnerty wrote of this action. One portion of his line under Captain Vroom pushed out beyond its supports, deceived by the rugged character of the ground, and suffered quite severely. In fact, the Indians got between it and the main body, and nothing but the coolness of its commander and the skillful management of Colonels Royal and Henry saved Troop L of the 3rd Cavalry from annihilation on that day. As the companies regrouped, a bullet struck Henry in the face, severely wounding him. Although he tried to stay mounted, he finally fell from his horse and onto the ground. Sioux and Cheyenne warriors raced to count coup on Henry's body, but the Shoshone scouts and some of the troopers drove the warriors off. This act undoubtedly saved the captain from being cut to pieces by the enemy warriors. Again, Finnerty later wrote a highly descriptive version of the event. Henry was struck by a bullet which passed through both cheekbones, broke the bridge of his nose, and destroyed the optic nerve to one eye. His orderly, in attempting to assist him, was also wounded, but temporarily blinded as he was and throwing blood from his mouth by the handful, Henry sat on his horse for several minutes in front of the enemy. He finally fell to the ground, and as that portion of our line, discouraged by the fall of so brave a chief, gave ground a little, the Sioux charged over his prostrate body but were speedily repelled, and he was happily rescued by some soldiers of his command. The Sioux and Cheyenne pressed Royal's two remaining companies so hard that their need to make an immediate escape became critical. With the Shoshone and Crow scouts fighting to keep the Sioux and Cheyenne at bay, the soldiers fled down the northeast slope of the ridge and towards Colmar Creek. From the next ridge, just to the east, Captains Burt and Burroughs companies provided a heavy cover fire for the retreat, with their longer-range Springfield infantry rifles. Lieutenant Banbridge Reynolds' Company F of the 3rd Cavalry suffered the most casualties during the retreat. The lieutenant lost a sergeant and several other enlisted men when the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors caught them isolated and on foot. One private foolishly attempted to surrender to an enemy warrior. The Indian clubbed and killed the trooper when he attempted to hand over his carbine. That most of Royal's force escaped was only possible due to the extraordinary courage of the Crow and Shoshone scouts. Their bravery and tenacious fighting during the retreat saved the troopers from annihilation. After they retrieved their mounts from Lead Horse Ravine, Royal and his remaining troopers finally reached Crook's Ridge after nearly 4.5 hours of relentless fighting. Before Royal's retreat to Crook's Hill, General Crook ordered Captain Mills to take companies A, E, and M to seek out and capture the enemy village, supposedly situated down the Rosebud Valley. Mills and his men departed Crook's Ridge and rode back down to the area of the morning bivouac. They then turned eastbound and followed Rosebud Creek. Not long after this order, Crook dispatched 5 more companies to join and support Mills. Scout Frank Groward again led the way. Mills' force met little resistance, except for a small firefight with 30 to 40 warriors on the low bluffs near the Big Bend. After the little skirmish, Mills and his men rode northward along the creek in search of the Sioux and Cheyenne village. Not long after he had dispatched Mills to find the enemy village, Crook changed his mind. He realized Royal was in severe trouble on the ridge across from Colmar Creek and needed more than just the reinforcement of Burt and Burroughs' companies. The general sent his adjutant, Captain Nickerson, to recall Mills. When Nickerson caught up with the captain, Mills had not found any enemy village, and except for the small fight near the Big Bend, had not engaged any Sioux or Cheyenne warriors. Mills received the new order to return to the main command, so he led the troops up a gap in the hills on his left and out of Rosebud Canyon. His route brought him behind a large group of enemy warriors just northeast of Crook's Hill. When the Sioux and Cheyenne saw the enemy soldiers approaching them from behind, they retreated from the battlefield. Having had enough fighting for the day, they gathered their dead and wounded and rode back to their villages. The Battle of the Rosebud lasted 6 hours. In his official report on the battle, Crook reported that 9 soldiers and 1 Indian scout were killed, and there were 21 wounded. In his official report, Colonel Royal gave the same number killed and 13 wounded. Bourke reported the command suffered 57 killed or wounded, not including those casualties of the friendly Indian scouts. A few other participants gave different casualty numbers, but almost all first-hand reports state that 9 soldiers were killed. Most of the wounded soldiers, and all of the killed, were from Royal's 3rd Cavalry, and most of the casualties occurred during the ferocious battle on Royal Ridge and the subsequent retreat to Crook's Ridge. Various Sioux and Cheyenne participants later gave diverse accounts as to the number of their dead and wounded. The total number cannot be determined. Young Two Moon reported 3 Cheyenne were killed. Crazy Horse later told an interviewer that 36 warriors were killed and 63 wounded. General Crook reported that at least 13 dead Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were left on the battlefield near his line. That evening, the command buried their dead comrades and cared for the wounded. The dead soldiers were initially buried in one of the banks of Rosebud Creek near the site of the bivouac, and the next morning horses were led over the gravesite to conceal it, so that it would not later be dug up by the Indians. Early the next morning, Crook's men arose and readied to move back to the supply camp on Goose Creek. The command had used about 25,000 rounds of ammunition during the battle, and their ammunition was nearly depleted. They were short on rations and needed to care for the wounded. The command had no choice but to terminate the expedition. The severely wounded men, including Captain Henry, were placed on travois that were pulled by mules. The command moved out and followed the northwest bank of the Rosebud's South Fork. Rather than use the same route they had used coming into the valley, Crook decided to leave in a more westerly direction towards the Bighorn Mountains. Crook hoped the new route would make it easier on the wounded by avoiding the rough terrain and many ravines the command had encountered before. In fact, the new route was as bad, if not worse, than the previous one. The first day they traveled 22 miles and crossed the divide between the Rosebud and the Little Bighorn drainage. The command arrived back at their wagon train on Goose Creek the next day, June 19th. 4 men later received the Congressional Medal of Honor for their actions during the battle. Michael A. McGann, 1st Sergeant, Company F, 3rd Cavalry, citation for gallantry in action, Joseph Robinson, 1st Sergeant, Company D, 3rd Cavalry, citation for discharging his duties while in charge of the skirmish line, under fire with judgment and great coolness, and for bringing up the lead horses at a critical moment. John Shingle, 1st Sergeant, Troop I, 3rd U.S. Cavalry, citation for gallantry in action, and Elmer A. Snow, Trumpeter, Company M, 3rd Cavalry, citation for bravery in action while wounded in both arms. Both the warriors and the soldiers displayed great courage during the battle. Both sides had their heroes, and in a few cases both sides had their cowards. The Battle of the Rosebud was truly a historical event. Rather than allow Crook to attack their village by surprise, as had occurred in March of 1876 on the Powder River, the Sioux and Cheyenne attacked him at a place of their choosing. In terms of achieving their goal, the Sioux and Cheyenne were successful and kept Crook away from their village. Perhaps even more significantly, the Sioux and Cheyenne gained confidence in their ability to successfully engage the U.S. Army. This confidence served them well 8 days later at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Chapter 4. Rosebud Battle. Artifact Identification and Analysis. J.W. Vaughn conducted the first serious and in-depth study of the Rosebud battlefield in the 1950s. An attorney from Greeley, Colorado, Vaughn had a long-term and profound interest in the Sioux-Indian War of 1876. His research was both scholarly and comprehensive. He studied countless documents, deciphered often inaccurate maps, and obtained information from local ranchers and the eminent historian of the Northern Cheyenne tribe, John Stans, in Timber. Vaughn was likely the first individual to utilize technology in conducting research at various battlefields from the 1870s. Evidently, Vaughn modified a World War II mine detector and turned it into one of the first, albeit heavy, metal detectors. With this equipment, Vaughn identified many important sites at the Rosebud battlefield in the 1950s. His book, With Crook at the Rosebud, detailed artifact discoveries and his analysis of the battle. Another historian, Fred H. Werner, conducted limited exploration of the battlefield during a 4-year period beginning in 1974. While Werner recovered over 100 battlefield artifacts, his discoveries were minor and covered much of the same areas previously found by Vaughn. J.W. Vaughn conducted his research on 4 separate ranches. The ranch owners included Elmer Slim Cobold, Charles Young, Bill Rugg, and Tom Penson. All 4 ranchers were early settlers to the area and generously allowed Vaughn to search their ranches for physical evidence from the battle. Since the battlefield area encompasses nearly 10 square miles, Vaughn traversed a lot of land to find the locations of specific battlefield events. Elmer Kobold sold his ranch to the state of Montana, and the Rosebud Battlefield State Park was established in 1978 under the management of the Montana State Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department. The park encompasses approximately 2/3 of the land where the battle occurred. In addition to the battlefield site, the park contains numerous rock cairns, piles of rocks that serve as a memorial to somebody who died during the battle or to mark the location of a significant event, teepee rings, and at least one buffalo jump. Archaeologists have traced the buffalo jump to approximately 3000 BC and have uncovered numerous artifacts associated with early hunters and inhabitants of the area. When the Rosebud Battlefield State Park was established, the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department contracted with Montana State University to conduct a survey of the site. The survey was conducted in 1980 and 1981 and focused primarily on prehistoric cultural activity. Artifacts recovered included stone flakes, stone tools, bone and fire-cracked rocks. Features discovered and attributed on early man were teepee rings, cairns, rock shelters, buried cultural strata, and petroglyphs. These discoveries were found not only on state land, but also on some of the surrounding private ranch land. The site is one of the richest areas in Montana in terms of prehistoric activity. Although the prehistory survey was conducted soon after the establishment of the park, as of the year 2007, apparently no archaeological survey has been conducted at the site devoted solely to the Battle of the Rosebud. The authors contacted the Montana FWP in February of 2007 and subsequently the Montana State Historic Preservation Office. Neither of these offices had any records to indicate such a survey of the battlefield had ever been conducted. Therefore, only a few individuals, beginning with J.W. Vaughn, have conducted searches of the site for battle-related artifacts. Historians anticipate future state or private funding to allow the Montana FWP to conduct an archaeological survey of the park property. This research project should focus solely on the Battle of the Rosebud. The authors of this book first visited the Rosebud battlefield site during the summer of 1989 and primarily focused on Lieutenant Colonel William Royal's operations along the western part of the battlefield. A note of caution is warranted to anyone planning to use a metal detector on or near the battlefield. Collecting any artifacts on the Rosebud Battlefield State Park is not allowed by park regulations, whether the artifacts are from prehistory periods or from the Battle of the Rosebud. Additionally, the area surrounding the park is private land. Visitors should please first seek permission from each individual landowner before going on to private land. Most of the private ranch owners do not allow metal detecting on their land. The owner of the site of Royal's second position has not allowed metal detecting since the late 1950s. In compliance with the owner's wishes, there was no research conducted on this portion of the battlefield. Weapons at the Rosebud Battle. The list of weapons used at the Battle of the Rosebud is extensive. The Sioux and Cheyenne especially used a wide variety of rifles and carbines. General Crook's force, including the civilians and Indian scouts, used a limited number of weapon types during the fight. This fact made it much easier for the authors to identify military positions versus Indian positions. Firearms associated with Crook's expedition. The majority of the discovered artifacts at the Rosebud battlefield, including those found by Vaughn, relate to Army usage during the battle, with the most common being the Springfield 45 or 55 and 45 or 70 caliber metallic cartridge cases. The U.S. Army Cavalry and Infantry Forces fired these cartridges from either the Model 1873 Springfield carbine or rifle. The cavalry used the shorter carbine, while the infantry used the rifle, nicknamed the Long Tom. These trapdoor single-shot weapons fired the same size cartridge. but the cavalry cartridge used 55 grains of black powder and had an effective range of about 600 yards. The infantry version contained 70 grains of powder and had an effective range of about 1,000 yards. The Springfield 45 or 55 and 45 or 70 cartridges look identical. Both are the same length, and both have a Binet internal centerfire primer. However, the 45 or 55 had a paper wad that served as filler inside the case to make up the gap for the smaller amount of powder. At times, the cavalry and the infantry used these two cartridges interchangeably, and without breaking open the cartridge or conducting an X-ray, it is impossible to tell the difference. The cavalry troopers were also equipped with the model 1873 .45 caliber Colt, a single-action revolver that held 6 rounds of ammunition. According to Lieutenant John Bourke, Miles Shoshone Scouts were supplied with the latest model caliber .45 Springfield rifle. The Crow Scouts primarily used various .50 caliber rifles or carbines. A few of the Indian allies likely carried a Henry or a Winchester repeating rifle, since this was a much prized weapon for fighting on horseback. Firearms of the Sioux and Cheyenne. The Indian-related cartridge cases recovered at the Rosebud battlefield were fired from a large assortment of rifles and carbines, and reflected the wide variety of weapons in possession of the Plains Indians during the 1870s. The Sioux and Cheyenne obtained their first rifles early in the 19th century. As stated by arms expert and author R. Stevan Dorsey, by the close of the 1830s, the day of the flintlock was over. The ease and sureness of fire of the percussion system made flintlock arms obsolescent, and weapons of this system became natural trading stock to Indians more than happy to lay down primitive bow, arrows, and lances for even flintlock firearms. The end of the American Civil War in 1865 was the driving force behind the Indians obtaining more modern weapons. Large surpluses of obsolete percussion cap rifles, carbines, and revolvers were readily available, and through trade and sale found their way to the western Indian tribes. They also began to obtain a few newer weapons that used the modern metallic cartridge, such as the Spencer rifle and carbine. In the late 1860s, the tribes obtained large quantities of the Henry .44 caliber repeating rifle. During the 1876 Sioux War, the Indians even had a few of the most modern and effective weapons available on the market: the Winchester Model 1873 .44 caliber rifle. Winchester rifles and carbines were one of the most used firearms by the Sioux and Cheyenne at all of the 1876 battlefields. But the warriors used whatever they had available, including their old flintlock and percussion cap rifles. The physical evidence uncovered at many of the battle sites indicated they still used their old reliable bows and arrows, Henry rifle, and Winchester rifle and carbine. One of the primary weapons used by the Sioux and Cheyenne during the 1876 Indian War period was the lever-action model 1866 Winchester rifle or carbine, and to a lesser degree the earlier model Henry rifle. Both of these weapons used the .44 caliber Henry rim-fire cartridge, and both had double firing pins. Although these repeating rifles and carbines had a shorter range than the Army's Springfield rifle and carbine, they were rapid-fire weapons, a definite plus in any battle. The .44 caliber Henry cartridges were manufactured in both the long and short versions, and most often had a raised H, designating they were manufactured by Winchester, stamped on the head of the case. Of all the Indian-related ammunition cases recovered at the Rosebud battlefield, the Henry .44 caliber was by far the most common. As with the .44, Henry cases recovered at the Little Bighorn battlefield during the archaeological survey of the 1980s. Many of the fired cases showed evidence of multiple firing pin strikes. The Henry rifle had dual firing pins. In fact, 25% of the Henry cases recovered had at least 2 sets of firing pin marks, one shallow set, which indicated the cartridge did not fire the first attempt, and the other deeper set, which indicated the successful firing of the cartridge. Some of the cases had more than one failed attempt. One case in particular showed 7 unsuccessful attempts before the cartridge actually fired. For the Sioux and Cheyenne, ammunition was not only valuable, it was also scarce. Rather than throw away the ammunition, the warriors made multiple attempts to fire the cartridge. The Henry rifle and the ammunition were not the causes of the misfires. Rather, the failure or inability to properly service the rifle was the issue. As detailed in Archaeological Insights into the Custer Battle, if the breech pin was dirty or rusty, a very hard blow was required before the firing pins would penetrate the rim of the cartridge deeply enough to detonate the primer. 50 caliber carbines and rifles. The Indians used a variety of 50 caliber carbines and rifles at the Rosebud. Before the Army adopted the Springfield 45 caliber rifle and carbine in 1873, it used the 50 caliber Springfield breech loader. With the adoption of the newer weapon, the Army got rid of the surplus 50 caliber Springfield rifles and carbines. Although some of the Plains Indian tribes already possessed a few of these weapons prior to 1873, they became even more readily available to the tribes when the U.S. government sold off the old surplus rifles and carbines to private traders and arms dealers. The most common 50 caliber weapons used by the Sioux and Cheyenne at the Rosebud were the Sharps, the Spencer, and Springfield rifles and carbines. While many different types of 50 caliber cases were found at the battlefield, the 50 or 70 Bennett prime case was the most predominant one. There were 4 types of primers used in the 50 or 70 cartridge during the Sioux War of 1876. The Benet, an internal primer, used in U.S. Army issued cartridges, the distinctively larger Martin primer, the Milbank primer, and the Verdun primer. All 4 types of these primers were represented in the 50 caliber cases recovered at the site. Besides the cases and unfired ammunition recovered, the authors found a few metal arrowheads as well. 2 arrowheads were recovered on top of Royal Ridge, and one was found at the southeast base of the ridge, charged by Mills companies at the beginning of the battle. Mills' first charge. Jason Pitch of Garryowen, Montana, found 2 iron arrowheads just to the west of a small hill north of Rosebud Creek, and 700 yards northeast of where the North Fork and South Fork of the Rosebud meet. Artifact identification and analysis. The rest of this chapter lists and analyzes the artifacts recovered at the Rosebud battlefield by the authors from 1989 to 2006. Some of J.W. Vaughan's artifact recoveries are also addressed, but only for those locations where it is known that both the authors of this book and Vaughan recovered ammunition cases. As stated before, the authors did not conduct a search of the entire battlefield. The search was primarily limited to the area of Mills' first charge, Royal's first position, and the associated Indian positions on the surrounding ridges, and Royal's third position, Royal Ridge. The listing and analysis of artifacts recovered at specific sites is presented in the order of sequence of the events as they occurred during the battle. Mills' first charge. The first 20 minutes of the Rosebud battle involved General Crook's Crow and Shoshone scouts fighting back the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. As this initial stage of the battle occurred, Captain Mills readied 4 cavalry companies for the first of Crook's offensive movements against the Sioux and Cheyenne. Mills' companies mounted their horses and rode eastward along the south bank of Rosebud Creek. When they reached a point southeast of Sioux Gap, they crossed the creek and then charged headlong at a large group of warriors gathered on top of the ridge at the southeast side of the gap. As they rode towards the ridge, the troopers fired their carbines and revolvers at the warriors. When they reached base of the ridge, the companies dismounted and spread. Primarily using their revolvers, some of the troopers charged directly up the crest of the ridge and attacked the left flank of the warriors. Other troopers charged northwest, bound in a swale just to the east of the crest, and attacked the rear of the warrior positions. Within a brief period, Mills' troopers had driven the enemy from the ridge, and the warriors retreated to the hills just to the northwest. One .45 caliber unfired Colt cartridge was recovered along the route of Mills' charge. It was found in the hayfield south of the present-day road, halfway between the creek and the ridge manned by the Sioux and Cheyenne. At the extreme southeast end of the ridge, and just north of the present-day road, one iron arrowhead was recovered, evidence that at least one warrior was using a bow and arrows against the charging troopers. Along the southeast crest of the ridge leading up to the Indian position, 8 .45 caliber Springfield bullets were recovered, 3 of which were flattened and distorted. One very distorted and unknown caliber bullet was also recovered. Mills' charging troopers fired these bullets at the warriors atop the ridge. Also on the southeast crest, one .44 caliber Henry case was recovered. The location where this case was found, along with the .45 caliber Springfield bullets found in the same vicinity, indicated at least some of the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were initially at that location, instead of at the top of the ridge with the other warriors. One .44 caliber Henry bullet was also recovered on the extreme southeast end of the ridge. A warrior atop the ridge had fired this bullet at a soldier during Mills' charge from the southeast. 2 .45 caliber Springfield cases were recovered on the northeast slope of the ridge, near the midpoint. Troopers charging up the swale on the east side of the ridge had fired the cases. 29 .44 caliber Henry cases were recovered on top or just below on the northeast slope, and all were fired by the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors on top of the ridge. The majority of the .44 Henrys were probably fired at the troopers at the bivouac site along Rosebud Creek, while a lesser number were likely fired at Mills' companies when they charged the ridge. One unfired, but broken .44 caliber Henry cartridge was also found on top of the ridge. The authors recovered one .50 caliber Springfield cartridge, broken in half, just below and to the west of the ridge on the flat, on a small rocky knoll north of the road, and just east of the park boundary fence. One Henry .44 caliber case and one Henry .44 caliber cartridge were recovered. The two locations where the broken .50 caliber Springfield cartridge, the Henry case, and Henry cartridge were found indicated the initial Sioux and Cheyenne charge was in very close proximity to Crook's bivouac site, southeast end of Royal Ridge. After the 4th and 9th Infantry and 3 companies of the 2nd Cavalry drove the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors back from the northern bluffs, many warriors retreated to the west. These warriors, along with others, gathered in large numbers to the west of Crook's force. They formed new positions on a ridge, which jutted onto the valley floor from the northwest and planned to attack the soldiers' left flank. Major Evans ordered Captain Guy Henry to take companies D and F of the 3rd Cavalry to the west and form a line to prevent the Indians from turning our supposed left. A few warriors gathered on a small hill at the extreme southeast end of the ridge. This hill is located just south of the present-day private road and just west of the park boundary fence. Evidence of the Sioux and Cheyenne presence on the hill was recovered in 1992, and the authors designated this site as Jesse Huffman Ranch Indian Position 1. 2 iron arrowheads were recovered only a few yards west of Jesse Huffman Ranch Indian Position 1 in the present-day hayfield, on top of the hill. One fired .45 caliber Schofield revolver case and one fired .44 Henry case were found. Atop the very southeast end of the hill, the forearm band from a Springfield carbine was recovered. The forearm band appears to have come from an early model, Springfield .50 caliber trapdoor carbine. Royal's first position. The western part of the Rosebud battle occurred on a series of 3 ridges overlooking Colmar Creek to the north. Lieutenant Colonel Royal led 5 companies, B, D, F, I, and L, all of the 3rd Cavalry, beginning their charge from along Rosebud Creek not far from the West Bend. Royal's force attacked a large group of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors gathered in the hills just to the north. Royal's companies drove the warriors back to the northwest from one ridge to another and finally stopped at the east end of the ridge just south of the headwater of Colmar Creek. All of Royal's troopers remained on the south slope of the ridge for protection from the Indian bullets coming at them from the north and west. Some of the troopers maneuvered about 100 yards further west along the slope. Royal's force may have remained at the position for about 1 hour. However, J.W. Vaughn believed the time spent there might have been much less than that. J.W. Vaughn was the first to discover Royal's first position in the 1950s. He recovered 23 of the troopers' fired .45 caliber Springfield cases from the center of the ridge to the very east end of the ridge, and indicated the heaviest concentration of cases was at the east end. Vaughn also recovered 1 unfired .45 or .55 caliber Springfield cartridge and 1 fired .44 caliber Bulldog revolver short base shell on the crest of the slope. He stated this case had been fired by an Indian at Royal's force when it retreated to the next ridge to the southeast. The authors rediscovered Royal's location at the east end of this ridge in 1989. On the southern slope, at the same location where Vaughn had found his artifacts, the authors recovered 35 .45 caliber Springfield cases, 3 unfired .45 or .55 caliber Springfield cartridges, 2 fired .50 caliber Bennett primed cases, and 2 .50 caliber bullets. The recovery area on the eastern end of the ridge began 30 yards from the current fence line, which is also where the ridge begins, and continued westbound for 70 yards. Most of the cases were on the slope and within 25 yards of the ridge's crest. The Springfield ammunition artifacts are obviously attributable to Royal's troopers. Warriors, positioned at any of a number of locations to the south or southwest of Royal, had fired the 2 .50 caliber bullets at the troopers. The 2 fired .50 caliber Bennett primed cases are distinctive among the artifacts recovered at this location. Because these cases cannot be attributed to soldier usage, Sioux or Cheyenne warriors might have fired them later in the battle. Another possibility is that a civilian attached to Royal's command, such as R.B. Davenport of the New York Herald, might have fired these 2 cases. It is unknown what type of weapon, if any, that Davenport carried. On the northern slope of the same area as above, 1 fired .44 caliber Henry case and 1 unfired .45 or .55 Springfield cartridge were recovered only 10 yards from the crest of the ridge. The .44 caliber Henry case was likely fired at Royal's troops when they were at Royal's second. As Soldier obviously dropped the .45 or .55 Springfield cartridge, but curiously, it was on the northern slope of the ridge rather than on the southern. Perhaps one of the soldiers was on the northern side of the ridge for a short period. The lack of fired Springfield cases recovered by either Vaughn or the authors on the northern slope indicates Royal's force huddled down on the south slope to protect themselves from the rifle fire of the warriors to the west and on the ridge north of Colmar Creek, 300 yards further west from the end of the ridge. And also on the southern slope, the authors found 12 fired .45 caliber Springfield cases and 3 unfired .45 or .55 Springfield cartridges. The authors did not find any soldier ammunition further west of this location. Andrews Platoon and Andrews Point. Andrews Point is the highest point of elevation on the ridge and is 700 yards west of Royal's first position. No .45 Springfield cases or cartridges were recovered west of this high rocky point. The artifacts recovered at the site were either located in the narrow spaces between the large boulders, just below the boulders on the northern slope of the ridge, and on a flat just south of the boulders. The authors found only 5 artifacts attributable to Andrews' platoon. 4 fired .45 caliber Springfield cases and 1 fired .45 caliber Colt revolver case. 3 of the Springfield cases had the standard Bennett primer, but the 4th had a Milbank primer. 1 or more of the 45 cases might also be attributed to Lieutenant Bourke, who was at the site later in the battle. The other recovered artifacts at the Andrews Point site were all fired cases, and all were attributable to Indian usage. The cases included the following: 9 50 or 70 caliber cases. The cases included Bennett, Martin, Milbank, and Bourdon primers, and were fired in a variety of 50 caliber weapons: 12 44 caliber Henry cases, 3 56 or 52 Spencer cases, 2 with an H head stamp, 1 56 or 50 case with a Sage Ammunition Works head stamp and fired in a Sharps Henkin rifle or carbine, and 1 50 or 70 caliber bullet. All of the Indian ammunition attributed to Indian usage was probably fired at the troopers at Royall's first, but perhaps some was fired at Royall's second position, about 2/3 of the way between the eastern end of the ridge and Andrews Point, going westbound. And on top of the ridge was another position that was manned at different times by both the soldiers and the warriors. General location at 45 degrees, 14 minutes, 5 seconds latitude north, and 107 degrees, 1 minute, 31 seconds longitude west. The site is rocky and is rather small. At this location, 3 fired .45 Springfield cases and 4 fired .44 Henry cases were recovered. It is probable that the Army Springfield cases were fired when Andrews' platoon rode up to Andrews Point. It is uncertain as to the time period. The Henry cases were fired by the warriors. Surprisingly, many of the cases recovered at Royall's first, Andrews Point, and at the west end of the ridge were found on top of the ground. Numerous cases had a dark or black patina, an indication the cases had been exposed to the sunlight and elements for quite some time. Western end of Royall's first position ridge. At the western end of Royall's first position ridge, the authors discovered 2 Indian positions in close proximity to each other. The authors combined these 2 sites and designated it as Royall's first Indian position west, number 1. Near the western end of the ridge, and on the southern side of the crest, there is a large formation of sizable boulders. This Indian position was previously undiscovered, and at this location 6 fired .44 Henry cases were found. The cases were likely shot by warriors firing at Andrews' position only a few hundred yards to the east. From the boulders, the warriors could clearly see Andrews' platoon, and with an effective range of 600 yards, the .44 Henry carbine and rifle were well within their range to inflict damage on Andrews' platoon. From this same site, the warriors may also fire down on Royall's troops at the east end of the ridge. The distance was again within the Henry's effective range, and the warriors could easily have hit Royall's men on the west end of the troopers' line. Just to the west of the boulders, the western end of the ridge drops off about 10 feet onto a saddle or flat that is connected to the next ridge to the west. On the slope leading to the saddle, the authors discovered another Indian position in 1991. As with the Indian position at the boulder formation, this site had not been previously discovered. At and near the western end of the ridge, the authors recovered a wide variety of fired ammunition cases attributable to Indian usage. These included 15 44 caliber Henry cases, 2 50 or 70 caliber cases, 1 Milbank primed and 1 Martin primed, 1 56 or 52 Spencer case, and 1 56 or 50 case with a saw head stamp, both fired from a Spencer rifle or carbine. 1 revolver case was recovered, a .45 caliber Schofield. Although typically attributable to Army usage, this Schofield case was from Indian usage. Due to its location, this site was probably used to fire at the troops at Andrews Point. The terrain would not have allowed the Indians at this position to fire at Royal's troops at the opposite end of the ridge. In the early 1990s, Steve Booras found another previously undiscovered Indian position 100 yards to the northwest of the western end of the ridge. The authors designated this site as R1IPW2. At this position, Booras recovered the following artifacts: 1 56 or 52 Spencer case, 2 56 or 56 caliber Spencer cases, 4 50 or 70 cases, 2 with Martin primers, 1 with a Milbank primer and 1 with a Bennett primer, 1 56 or 50 caliber case, head-stamped saw, and 1 50 caliber case with an H head stamp. Booras also recovered 2 44 caliber Henry cases. The warriors at this site had fired their weapons at the troopers located at Andrews Point. Indian positions. North of Royal's first position, the authors found 3 previously undiscovered Sioux and Cheyenne positions north of Royal's first position. The positions are located on the flat-topped ridgeline just to the north of the headwater of Colmar Creek. Of the 3 positions, the eastern position is located northeast of Royal's first and north of Royal's second position. The other 2 Indian positions, R1IPN2 and R1IPN3, are located to the west of R1IPN1 and are north of Andrews Point. The warriors at R1IPN2 and R1IPN3 probably fired their weapons at the troopers at Andrews Point and at Royal's first. At R1IPN1, the following Indian usage artifacts were recovered: 1 fired 56 or 52 Spencer case, and 2 fired 44 Henry cases. The warriors at R1IPN1 probably fired their weapons at the troopers while they were at Royal's first or second positions. The authors also found 2 45 caliber Springfield bullets at the site. Royal's force had fired the bullets at the Indians occupying this position. 1 Army artifact was also recovered, a fired .45 Springfield case with a Bennett primer. The .45 case was an anomaly and found on the opposite slope, southwest side of this Indian position. Perhaps one of the men with Randall or Bork fired the case during the charge up Colmar Creek. The artifacts recovered at R1IPN2 included 2 fired 50 or 70 caliber brass cases with Burdon primers and 2 44 caliber Henry fired cases. R1IPN3 is just to the south of R1IPN2. 1 fired 50 or 70 caliber case with a Martin primer was recovered at the site. Royal's second position. The authors did not conduct any research at Royal's second position. However, a few photographic images were taken and appear in this chapter. There is a concrete post atop the west end of the ridge to mark the position, with an approximate latitude or longitude reading of 45 degrees, 13 minutes, 49 seconds, north, 107 degrees, 1 minute, 9 seconds, west. J.W. Vaughn Metal detected the site in the 1950s. At Royal's second position, he recovered 15 fired 45 or 70 cases and 3 fired 50 or 70 cases with Martin primers. Saddle between Royal's second and Royal's third. As described in the previous chapter, there is a quarter-mile gap separating Royal's second position ridge and Royal's third position, Royal Ridge. On the western side, the gap begins at the eastern end of Royal's second position ridge. A fence there runs north and south and separates Mary Young's ranch from the one adjoining it to the east, owned by Jesse Huffman. The gap terminates just to the southwest of the small conical hill, which is located at the northwest end of Royal Ridge. As described by J.W. Vaughn in With Crook at the Rosebud, when some of the troopers reached the gap, they rode slightly to the left and crossed over to the north slope of the next ridge to the east, the North Slope route. The authors spent time exploring the north side of the ridgeline but found only limited physical evidence to indicate the presence of Royal's troopers. The authors concentrated on the south side of the gap, the South Slope route. The large amount of physical evidence recovered on the south side of the ridge indicated that most of Royal's troops used the south slope route. The area covering the south slope route is roughly 50 yards wide and a quarter-mile long. As the soldiers retreated further eastward, their route widened. Along the south slope route, the authors recovered numerous artifacts. For simplicity, the authors have split the south slope route into two sections. The first section is 1/8 of a mile wide, begins at the Mary Young Ranch fence, and continues eastward to an imaginary north or south line. In this section, 7 .45 Springfield bullets, 1 unfired .45 or .55 Springfield cartridge, 1 fired .45 caliber Springfield case, 1 .50 caliber bullet, 1 .44 caliber Henry bullet, and 2 deformed unknown caliber bullets were recovered. The large number of Springfield bullets indicated many Sioux and Cheyenne warriors trailed directly behind the retreating soldiers, and the troopers had fired at their pursuers. The .50 and .44 caliber bullets were fired at the soldiers retreating to Royal Ridge, on the south slope route, from the imaginary line and proceeding eastward to the area just southwest of and below the small conical hill. The authors recovered 21 artifacts, 7 fired .45 caliber Springfield cases, 13 unfired .45 or .55 caliber Springfield cartridges, and 1 .50 caliber bullet were found. The unfired .45 or .55 rounds were scattered along the retreat line, with most of them near a small rock formation just to the southwest of the small conical hill. The large number of dropped live rounds indicated Royal's men were under severe pressure from their pursuers. The troopers tried to reload their carbines while they rode rapidly towards Royal Ridge. Given the circumstances, their attempt to reload their single-shot carbines was a difficult task at best, and it is no wonder that they dropped numerous rounds of ammunition. Indian positions northwest of Small Conical Hill. Indian positions northwest of Small Conical Hill. The authors discovered 2 Indian positions that are possibly from 2 different periods during the battle. One of the positions is in the valley just south of Colmar Creek, and the second position is on top of the high ridge north of Colmar Creek and due north of the Small Conical Hill. The position south of Colmar Creek is located at 2 small boulder formations. Both formations are very close to each other and are just to the north-northwest of the Small Conical Hill. This site is associated with one of the most celebrated events of the battle, the rescue of the Cheyenne warrior Limpy by young Two Moon. Some of Royal's troopers used the north slope route to retreat from the second position to the third, and they were fired upon by a group of 6 Cheyenne warriors located at the rock formations. When the soldiers made a counterattack on the Indian position, all the warriors escaped on their ponies. That is, except Limpy. The warrior had his horse shot from under him and was left alone and vulnerable at the rock formation. Young Two Moon saw that Limpy was in great peril and exposed to heavy gunfire from the soldiers. The young warrior rode in and rescued Limpy. This location is now known as Limpy's Rocks. Surrounding the rock formations, the following Indian-related artifacts were recovered: 4 fired .56 or .56 Spencer cases, 3 fired .56 or .52 Spencer cases, and 7 fired .44 caliber Henry cases. All of the cases recovered at Limpy's Rocks were likely fired at Royal's troops during their retreat to Royal Ridge. It is also possible some of the cases were fired at another time, such as when the Crow and Shoshone scouts attacked the Sioux and Cheyenne and drove them up Colmar Creek. The Indian position atop the ridge north of Colmar Creek has a commanding view of the valley below and of Royal's second and third positions. The artifacts at this location were recovered in a ravine leading up to the ridge and along the south rim of the ridge. 5 fired .50 or .70 caliber cases were found, 3 of which were Bennett prime copper cases and 2 were brass cases with Milbank, possibly a Farrington primers. 2 .45 Springfield bullets were also found. likely fired by the soldiers atop Royal Ridge. Oddly, 3 fired .45 Springfield cases were found at the location. It is believed the Cheyenne and Sioux did not capture any Army Springfield carbines or rifles until the heavy fighting on Royal Ridge. It seems to the authors that there are 2 plausible reasons as to why the 45 cases were at this location. The first possibility is that some of Crook's forces were in the area during the attack on Conical Hill. The other possibility is the warriors occupied this location after they had captured some of the soldier carbines on Royal Ridge and had fired into Crook's forces atop Crook's Ridge near the end of the battle. Retreat route below, Royal Ridge. As stated in the previous chapter, some of the troopers who used the South Slope route during the retreat from the 2nd position to the 3rd did not immediately ride up to the crest of the ridge. Instead, they stayed below the southwest slope and did not ride up to the crest until reaching a deep ravine nearly 400 yards past the small Conical Hill. Along this route, beginning at a point south of the small Conical Hill and proceeding southeast below the southwest slope of the ridge until reaching the ravine, the following artifacts were recovered: 6 unfired .45 or 55 Springfield cartridges, 5 fired .45 Springfield cases, 1 fired .50 or 70 caliber case, 2 50 caliber bullets, 1 44 caliber Henry bullet, and 1 54 caliber round ball. Like the evidence along the South Slope route, the number of unfired .45 Springfield cases below the southwestern slope of Royal Ridge indicates the troopers had ridden their horses at a rapid gait, fired their weapons as they went, and occasionally dropped live ammunition when they attempted to reload. Warriors shooting at the retreating troopers fired all of the bullets. Northern slope of small Conical Hill and vicinity. J.W. Vaughn indicated he found 8 various caliber fired cases and 2 bullets near and on the north slope of the small Conical Hill. We recovered 1 fired .45 Springfield case from a soldier on the northeast slope and 1 flattened 50 caliber bullet on the northern slope. As described by Vaughn, the soldier who fired the Springfield case was on the retreat line north of the hill. The 50 caliber bullet could have been fired from any number of Indian positions to the northwest and north of the hill. Southern slope of small Conical Hill. As stated before, most of the troopers using the South Slope route rode just to the south of the small Conical Hill, then up a slight incline to reach the crest of Royal Ridge. The artifacts recovered on the south slope of the hill included 1 .45 caliber Springfield bullet, 1 44 caliber Henry bullet, 1 bullet from a 50 or 70 case, and 1 50 caliber Sharps bullet. A trooper fired the 45 caliber Springfield bullet at one of the pursuing warriors. Sioux and Cheyenne warriors fired the other 3 bullets at the retreating soldiers riding up and onto Royal Ridge. Also recovered were 14 fired .45 Springfield cases and 6 unfired .45 or 55 Springfield cartridges. Again, the dropped cartridges indicated the troopers were in a rush to get to the top of Royal Ridge. Royal Ridge. In the mid-1950s, J.W. Vaughn was the first modern historian to recover large numbers of artifacts atop Royal Ridge. It should be noted that Vaughn did not actually discover the location of Royal Ridge. Not long after he began to recover artifacts on the ridge, John Stanton Timber, the noted Cheyenne historian, showed Vaughn the location where Captain Henry was wounded on the ridge. Obviously, the Cheyenne historian already knew the location of Royal's 3rd position. Vaughn recovered large numbers of fired Springfield .45 cases and unfired Springfield cartridges in a line 325 yards long on the crest of Royal Ridge. Royal Ridge runs northwest and southeast and is about 1 mile in length. Therefore, Vaughn found artifacts on approximately 1/5 of its length, mostly on the northwest portion of the ridge. Vaughn indicated he recovered 133 fired .45 caliber Springfield cases along the line and a host of other ammunition artifacts of various calibers and manufacture. The authors examined the same basic area on the crest of the ridge as Vaughn did. We recovered artifacts in a 400-yard arcing line from the northwestern point of the ridge where it connects with the small conical hill and proceeding southeast, bound to the present-day Rosebud State Park fence. The recovery area was just a few yards wide on the northwestern end of the ridge and expanded to about 135 yards wide near the southeastern end. Jesse Huffman, the authors and others recovered over 160 artifacts, mostly fired .45 Springfield cases, on top of the ridge. Our group found 111 fired .45 caliber Springfield cases along the entire length of the recovery area from the northwest to the southeast. Most of the .45 Springfield cases were recovered on the southeastern end of the area and within a 50-yard area next to the park boundary. Two areas had the heaviest concentration of fired cases, and the authors believe these two sites were trooper-related holding actions. The first site is on the southwestern edge of the ridge's rim, just above an Indian position, RRI P3, described in the next section, Royal Ridge Indian Positions, and is located at 45 degrees, 13 minutes, 26.9 seconds north, 107 degrees, 00 minutes, 26 seconds west. The position is roughly 10 yards in diameter. 15 fired .45 Springfield cases were recovered within its perimeter. The authors believe a small group of troopers occupied the position at the beginning of the action on Royal Ridge. The troopers evidently attempted to hold off the Sioux and Cheyenne attacking from the west. The second site is on the northeastern slope of Royal Ridge, approximately 60 yards northeast of the crest, and is located at 45 degrees, 13 minutes, 26.8 seconds north, and 107 degrees, 0 minutes, 15.5 seconds west. Within this oval-shaped depression, 18 fired .45 Springfield cases and one .50 caliber distorted bullet were recovered. We believe troopers occupied this holding action area towards the end of the fight on Royal Ridge, and they had attempted to hold back the pursuing warriors during Royal's retreat across Colmar Creek. This site might very well be the area where the Sioux and Cheyenne nearly annihilated Captain Vroom's company. 5 unfired .45 or .55 Springfield cartridges were recovered on the crest of Royal Ridge. Various individuals recovered 2 of these cartridges at the northwestern end of the ridge and 3 at the southeastern end near the park boundary fence. Only a few fired ammunition cases attributable to Sioux or Cheyenne warrior usage were recovered on top of the ridge. 1 fired .38 caliber Colt case. 1 fired .50 or .70 caliber Martin Prime case. And 2 fired .50 or .70 Bennett Prime cases were all recovered on the northwestern end of the ridge. The .50 or .70 Bennett Prime cases may have been fired by Crook's Shoshone or Crow Scouts, but that is unlikely since their location on the ridge during the rescue of Royal's companies was supposed to be at least 200 or 300 yards further southeast. Surprisingly, Vaughn did not find many Sioux or Cheyenne-related ammunition cases on Royal Ridge either, given the fact that all of the heavy fighting occurred on top of the ridge. It seems that there should have been more Indian-related ammunition cases recovered. 2 metal, iron, arrowheads were recovered near the northeastern end of Royal's Ridge and 40 yards northeast of Indian Position Number 3. The arrowheads lend credence to reports in some of the military accounts that the Sioux and Cheyenne used not only rifles and carbines but also bows and arrows. 35 bullets of various makes and calibers were also found along the length of the recovery area. Of these, 11 were .45 caliber Springfield bullets fired by members of Crook's force. We could not determine the locations from where the bullets were fired. The remaining 24 bullets are attributed to the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors and included 5 .44 caliber Henrys, 10 .50 caliber bullets of various manufacture, 3 .54 caliber round balls, 3 .44 caliber round balls, and 3 deformed and undetermined caliber bullets. The Indian-related bullets were recovered at various locations on top of the ridge and were spread along the entire length of the recovery area. Royal Ridge Indian positions. 4 separate and previously undiscovered Sioux and Cheyenne Indian positions were found on the southwest slope of Royal Ridge in 1989. The authors designated the positions as RRIP-1, Royal Ridge Indian Position Number 1, RRIP-2, etc., with RRIP-1 beginning just southeast of the small conical hill, and RRIP-4 ending at the park boundary fence. The positions were numbered sequentially from northwest to southeast for reasons of simplicity rather than in the order of occupation by the Indians or discovery by the authors. However, it is likely RIP-1 was the first to be occupied by the Sioux and Cheyenne since they closely pursued Royal's retreating troopers. Sioux and Cheyenne-related ammunition cases literally covered the entire length of the southwest slope. RRIP-1. On its northwestern end, RRIP-1 begins just to the southeast of the small conical hill. At this location, 9 fired .44 caliber Henry cases, 2 fired .45 caliber Springfield cases, 1 fired .56 or .50 Spencer case, and 1 .45 caliber Springfield bullet were recovered, except for the 2 .45 Springfield cases and the .45 caliber Springfield bullet. All of the artifacts were attributed to Indian usage. One of the .44 Henry cases had a single firing pin mark on its rim, and appears it was fired in either a Remington or a Colt revolver. The warriors had protected themselves from the soldiers' bullets by remaining just below the ridge's southwest rim, and exposed themselves only long enough to fire their weapons at Royal's troopers above them on the crest. Troopers likely fired the 2 Springfield cases during their retreat up onto Royal Ridge. RRIP-2. A small ravine or depression on the southwest slope separates RRIP-2 from RRIP-1. Due to the nature of the topography and the fact the Sioux and Cheyenne were closely following Royal's retreating cavalry force, it is likely the warriors manned RRIP-1 and RRIP-2 almost simultaneously upon reaching Royal Ridge. At this location, the following artifacts were recovered: 1 unfired .50 or .70 Springfield cartridge, 2 fired .45 caliber Springfield cases, 1 fired .44-40 Winchester case with a center fire primer, 10 fired .50 or .70 cases with various type primers, 4 Burden primed, 4 Martin primed, 1 Binet primed and 1 Bar Anvil primed, 5 fired .56 or .50 Spencer cases, 25 fired .44 Henry cases, 2 .50 caliber Springfield bullets, 1 .44 caliber Henry bullet, 2 .45 caliber Springfield bullets, and 1 distorted unknown type bullet. RRIP-3. A deep ravine separates RRIP-3 from RRIP-2. The topography of the slope of RRIP-3 is shaped like a quarter moon, with the center of the arc projecting to the west. Unlike the other 3 Indian positions, this site has a number of rock formations projecting from the rim, a natural breastworks the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors used to hide behind when they fired at the troopers. Some of the warriors at RRIP-3 likely moved over from RRIP-1 and RRIP-2. Other warriors probably occupied the position just after riding in from the west. At this site, the following artifacts were recovered: 3 fired .50 or .70 caliber cases, 2 Binet primed and 1 Burden primed, 5 fired .56 or .50 Spencer cases, 32 fired .44 caliber Henry cases, 3 fired .45 caliber Springfield cases, Army usage, 1 unfired .56 or .50 caliber Spencer cartridge, 2 .44 caliber Henry bullets, 4 .50 caliber Springfield bullets, and 2 .45 caliber Springfield bullets, Army usage. Interestingly, a warrior fired one of the .44 Henry cases in a Ballard single-shot rifle. The Ballard firing pin left a single and very deep groove on the head. A Henry's double firing pin system leaves noticeably shallower marks. Additionally, When the case was ejected from the chamber, the extractor left a noticeable deformity or tear on the rim of the case. RRIP4. Another deep ravine separates RRIP4 from RRIP3. As stated before, RRIP4 proceeds in a southeasterly direction and terminates at the Rosebud Battlefield State Park fence. It is likely this portion of the ridge was the last to be occupied by the warriors. However, the time difference was likely only a matter of minutes. At RRIP4, the following artifacts were recovered: 7 fired .44 caliber Henry cases, 1 .45 caliber Springfield case, split and expanded because it was fired in a larger caliber unknown weapon, but likely a .50 or .70 rifle or carbine, 1 unfired .45 caliber Sharps cartridge, and 1 .45 caliber Colt bullet. Indian positions south of Royal Ridge. Steve Booras discovered 2 Indian positions, JHRIP2 and JHRIP3, on the next ridge south of Royal Ridge. These 2 sites are associated with the fight at Royal's 3rd position, and the warriors at these positions had a clear view of Royal Ridge. JHRIP2 is located just to the northwest of JHRIP1. From this position, the warriors were only 700 yards southeast of Royal's troops. At this site, Booras recovered 3 fired .44 caliber Henry cases and 3 fired .50 or .70 cases with Bennett primers. JHRIP3 is located a little over 300 yards to the northwest of JHRIP2. From this position, the warriors were only 500 yards from the troopers on Royal Ridge. At this site, Booras recovered 1 fired .44 caliber Henry case, 1 fired .56 or .50 caliber case with a raised H head stamp, indicating manufacture by Winchester, and 1 fired .45 caliber Springfield case with a Bennett primer. The .45 Springfield case recovered was very unusual since it was expanded and split. Most likely a warrior had used a .50 or .70 caliber rifle or carbine to fire a .45 caliber cartridge. The terrain at both JHRIP2 and JHRIP3 protected the warriors from being hit by any soldier bullets. The warriors hid behind the crest of the slope and safely fired their weapons at the troopers on Royal Ridge. No triumph for Crook. While Crook was not defeated on the battlefield, he did not triumph either. Neither the soldiers nor the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors earned a decisive victory, and in the end, the loser was Crook. The Sioux and Cheyenne checked Crook's advance up Rosebud Creek, and he was not able to complete his intended mission. Crook's stalemate at the Rosebud and his failure to meet up with Terry and Custer would prove to be disastrous for Custer and his command along the Little Bighorn River only 8 days later. Chapter 5. Where are the soldiers buried? As stated in Chapter 3, on the evening of June 17th, General Crook's command buried their 9 dead comrades along the banks of Rosebud Creek. One soldier participant in the battle reported that the soldiers were later reburied. Crook's command reinterred the soldiers when they passed through the battlefield on their way to meet up with General Terry's force in early August. According to one document, the grave site, the second burial, was found in 1931. Jesse Huffman, owner of the ranch where the 2 forks of the Rosebud meet, showed the authors a copy of 2 memorandums dated in 1931. The memorandums are from Victor A. Bolsius, then superintendent of the Custer Battlefield National Cemetery. The first document is addressed to the Office of the Corps Area Quartermaster, Headquarters 9th Corps Area, Presidio of San Francisco, California. This memorandum gives a report regarding the superintendent's attempt to find the gravesite on July 21, 1931. Mr. Bolsius found the following 9 headstones: Eugene Flynn, Alan J. Mitchell, Richard Bennett, George Potts, Gilbert Rowe, Brooks Connor, David Marshall, William Walk, Sergeant Anton Newkirchen. Superintendent Bolius questioned whether the headstones marked the actual gravesite, or were just markers. After visiting with some of the local residents, including Mr. Tom Penson, who owned the land where the markers stood, Mr. Bolius concluded the headstones did not mark the actual site of the graves. In a September 19, 1931 memorandum to the same office at the Presidio, Mr. Bolius reported that with the help of a local rancher, Mr. Charles Young, he had located the gravesite of the 9 soldiers about 3 miles west of the site where the markers stood. Mr. Bolius dug into the gravesite and satisfied himself that the site did indeed hold the remains of the soldiers killed during the Rosebud battle. The superintendent recommended removal of the markers and the bodies of the soldiers to the National Cemetery at the Custer battlefield. In April of 2007, the authors contacted Mr. John Dorner, chief historian at the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. Mr. Dorner checked the cemetery records at the battlefield and determined none of the names of the soldiers killed at the Rosebud battle appeared in the cemetery records. Mr. Dorner was of the opinion that, although Superintendent Bolius found the remains in 1931 and had recommended a reburial at the Little Bighorn Cemetery, the mission was never conducted. The remains of the 9 soldiers evidently remained buried along Rosebud Creek. In Vaughn's with Crook at the Rosebud, the author wrote, Charles Young tells about another place, within a sharp U-bend in the stream, a mile west of Kobold's house, where it is believed by some that some of the soldiers are buried. About 100 yards to the southwest of the bend was located a large tree, upon which the letters U.S., together with an arrow pointing to the U-bend, had been burned, presumably by a ramrod. Vaughn continued, This tree was cut down years ago by an early settler, below the burnt writing, and only the squared stump remains. Mr. Young showed the above-described site to J.W. Vaughn in the 1950s. Even as late as the early 2000s, the squared stump remained visible. It was located near the south bank of Rosebud Creek, and just east of where the 2 forks of Rosebud Creek meet. This site is on the ranch now, owned by Ms. Jessie Huffman. Ms. Huffman, an expert on many aspects regarding the Rosebud battle, has spent a great deal of time studying the burial issue. She has concluded the soldiers were buried near the tree stump, but just across the creek and near the north bank.